Hi, my name is Michael Andrew, and I'm about to give you a free tutorial on the awesome Sony A7 IV. If you are an experienced photographer and you are looking for a specific topic, feel free to take advantage of the table of contents that we've built. We spent a lot of time putting this together using the feature of Control F or Command F. Type in the keyword that you're interested in. It should highlight in the table of contents, and you can click on the time marker. It'll take you directly to that lesson. Now, if this is your first real camera or you're new to photography, I have to give you a word of warning. This video is going to cover the basic operations and controls of the Sony A7 IV. It's very important to know which button does what and why you would want to do it. That said, this is not going to be enough for you to become a consistently great photographer. Sure, you can go out and get lucky, but we really want to understand what makes a great image, and there's many elements to this. Talking about things like the photography basics, or lighting, or composition, using a strobe. And then when you get into different types of shooting, the tactics and the philosophies change depending on whether you're doing sports shooting, or portrait photography, or video. And I say this because we are putting together, me and my team, an awesome Sony A7 IV crash course. It goes hand in hand with this video. If it's not out yet, find the link below. It'll take you to my blog. You can leave your name and your email address, and we will notify you as soon as it's ready. That also comes with a 30% discount. Another resource you should definitely check out is my Sony A7 IV Facebook group. This Facebook group is dedicated to the Sony A7 IV only. We only want positive vibes, learning, helping each other. The link is in the description. We have a ton of information to cover, so let's get started right now. Let's talk about some of the basic setups for your Sony A7 IV, and then we'll get into the buttons and the controls. You will notice that the cap, when it comes with the camera, there's a little tick mark here on the side. This is an alignment mark, and that alignment mark goes with this little white dot underneath. Now, there is no lock for the cap, but you can see we have this little button here right where our right ring finger would rest. So as we grip the camera, if you just slip your right ring finger there, I would recommend making this second nature so you can grip the camera, release a lens, rotate it off, and with your other hand, you would put the other lens on. We'll be talking about keeping your sensor clean in just a second. But releasing a lens should become second nature, like this. There's the beautiful sensor. And what you're going to notice is every Sony lens should have a white alignment mark. I would recommend making this second nature so you can grip the camera, release a lens, rotate it off, and with your other hand, you would put the other lens on. We'll be talking about keeping your sensor clean in just a second. The lens is locked, so you won't be able to remove it unless you push this button down here. Something I want to point out about lenses is that if you look underneath the cap, you should be able to see the lens thread size. In this case, it's 55 millimeters. What that refers to is the diameter for the threading of the lenses, and you'll need to know this size for any filters that you're putting onto your lens. So that's how you figure out at any time. Just look at the cap. We also have this lens hood, and lens hoods are great. When I first started shooting, I didn't really use them that much, but they offer glare protection, and they also have alignment marks. There's a little red tick up here. It's very hard to see. You see we've got a dot and a tick mark here. So the way this works is I'm going to get this long red mark. I'm going to line it up with the dot on the lens and do the same thing and rotate it until it clicks. Another side note is if you're looking for impact protection, there's a lot of good data that shows that lens hoods are far better in terms of impact protection. If you were to drop your camera and it was to hit the lens, this is going to absorb most of it. There's better protection here than a UV filter. As a UV manufacturer, I should be trying to sell you UV filters, right? The lens hood is far better for impact protection. Another common practice is to take your body cap and your lens cap and just put them together, put them in a place in your camera bag where you always know where they are, because these are very easy to lose. I get a ton of questions about tripods and tripod heads, and I just wanted to show this to you real quick. I love Bogin Manfrotto ball heads, but the way this works is there's something called a shoe that goes on the bottom of the camera. Now, different manufacturers have different shoes, but I prefer this one by Bogin Manfrotto. I think it's called the M200. It has a little lip here, and when I engage this into the clamp and push it down, it locks. You have to make sure it locks. Double confirm that, pull on it before you let it go. But the ball head is basically a metal ball attached to the camera that will allow me to position or orient the camera in any direction. And I use these for still shooting exclusively. When I go to video shooting, I use a different head that I can attach onto the tripod. So it's a fluid motion head that you can pan left to right. It's a different style of shooting. Near the end of this video, we will cover accessories. I will put links to Michael's bag, which is on my website, which has tons of different types of gear that I recommend. I really like the carbon fiber legs. They're expensive. They're about $400 from Bogan Manfrotto. This ball head is discontinued, but the current one they have is extremely sturdy. I just bought one for a friend, and I'll put those links also on Michael's gear bag. Real quick, when we're talking about batteries, you probably noticed when you got your camera, there was not a battery charger. The way this works is we plug the USB-C cable to charge directly in camera. Sony used to send out chargers back in the day, but now what I would recommend is getting a third-party charger. This is just a generic brand I found on Amazon, and I love it. Why? Because I can charge 2 batteries at a time. Now, it's great that we can charge the battery in camera, but there's going to be times where you're going to have an extra battery and you want to be shooting, you don't want to be charging. So 25, 30 bucks, something like that, they work great. And another thing I want to point out is that every battery has a set of pins here, and you're just thinking pins out, pins towards the grip and the inside. So this is the orientation. You're going to push it in until you hear a click. There's a blue release switch here to take it out. Then when we close the latch, we need to push this little switch over to lock it. I would also definitely recommend sticking with the Sony branded batteries. There are counterfeits out there, so make sure you get it from a seller that has a good reputation. I personally stay away from the third-party brands because sometimes there's problems with them or they don't work as well. Just spend the extra money on a good Sony battery. Every shooter, I believe, should have 2 batteries. If you're doing any pro work or production work, then obviously you might have 4, 5, 6 or more. Let's talk about memory cards real quick. Something you'll notice is that we have some diagrams on the inside. This says slot 1. Down here it says slot 2. But you'll also notice it says CF Express A. And in a very interesting feature that I haven't seen on many cameras is this is a dual card slot, meaning it can hold 2 different kinds of memory cards. The CF Express A is not compatible with CF Express B. You have to buy it specifically CF A, and they are very expensive. Some questions I get is, why would you want a CF Express A card? Is because they are lightning fast. You're buying it for speed, which really unlocks capabilities in terms of video and buffer clearance. So if you're doing a lot of sports shooting, you want to clear that buffer quickly, or if you need a higher data rate for certain types of video shooting, then you are going to want to get a CFA card. And I will be demonstrating that card and some of its capabilities on the crash course, the advanced crash course for those of you that get it. But you'll notice the bottom slot is just an SD card. So something to keep in mind is that there are actually different kinds of SD cards. If you rotate them and you look on the back, you'll see that I have one card that has 2 sets of pins and another card that has a single set of pins. But when we look from the front, they look almost exactly the same with the exception of the memory they hold, right? Well, when we look a little bit closer, there's some really important things here. We have a data rate. This is the UHS-2 card. This is the UHS-1 card. The data rates are different. This is 170. This is 300. It's a little worn. I highly recommend the SanDisk Extreme Pros. Absolutely, this is the #1 brand that I personally buy. What you are looking for, the minimum requirement, you will see there's a little U in a 3 here. Critically important, and we have that on both cards. That class U3 symbol is the minimum requirement for sustained 4K video shooting. So if you're going to do any kind of video shooting in 4K, your memory card will have to have that symbol. I can't tell you how many emails that I get from new users who are saying that they can only record a few seconds of video. This is always the problem. They find a memory card in their desk and they put it in their camera, and it's not a high performance card. So absolutely make sure that you get a high performance card that says U3, again, SanDisk Extreme Pros. This card, I believe it's not that much. I think it's less than 30 bucks. If you're on a budget, go with the 64 gigabyte. If you have more money, I would recommend the 128 gigabyte class 2 cards. They are faster. They clear the buffer a little bit faster. Something else you're going to notice, if you look right here, we have a Roman numeral 2, and over here we have a Roman numeral 1. I know it's kind of hard to see, but this is how subtle these differences are on these cards. Be sure to check the description when you are buying the card to make sure that if you want the Class 2, get the Class 2, read in the description versus the Class 1. But we even get a diagram in terms of how to put them into the camera with the notch down. So I'm going to put this guy in. Let's do this one. So I'm going to put this guy in. Kind of weird on the dual card slot. This is going to go towards the camera, the pins will. And so we can put both of them in at the same time like this, and you're going to push until you hear a click. And to remove it, you're going to push in again and pull it out. I would say be careful to make sure it goes in straight. You can damage the cards. And another thing is you'll notice there's a little switch here that will lock the card if you don't want to have anything written onto it. That happens too sometimes. People accidentally bump those. But for now, we're just going to start off with this one card. Let's go over all of the external buttons and controls so you know what I'm talking about as we move through the video. I would highly recommend getting your camera, having it in hand, and following along. Obviously, we have the power switch, which rotates from left to right, and there's a little indicator here on the switch, kind of hard to see. The power switch also hosts the shutter button, which you're going to be using quite a bit. Now, what I want you to do is to push the shutter button down and feel like there's this springy resistance. And push it down all the way, it takes a picture. So the halfway depression is how we engage our camera's focusing systems if we are using this button for focusing. There's some different techniques I'll show you later if you want to move it to back button, for example. But in the beginning, I think it's good that everybody learns to focus. Just touch it down, feel that spongy resistance, push it down all the way, and it takes a picture. This is going to be very useful for a technique called recomposing that I'll demonstrate a little bit later. Just in front of the power switch and the shutter button, we have the front control wheel. You're going to be using this to change your exposure settings that I'll demonstrate a little bit later. Kind of hard to see, but right here, we have an autofocus assist lamp, which means if we're shooting in a very dark situation, you will see this light up. It'll try to give us a little illumination to have something to focus against. It will also flash when we are using a timer. We've already covered the lens release down here. In the front of the camera, we have a switch that has a little button on it. If you push, you can rotate this to the left and right, and if you do not push, it will remain locked. This deals with our camera's shooting mode, talking about the difference between stills shooting and video recording. And I'll show you this in the back in just a second. Sometimes I get questions from users is, what is this little icon or symbol here? This symbol tells us the exact position of our sensor. So if you wanted to measure the distance between your sensor and an object, this is how you would do it. Taking a look at the top-down view, over here we have the mode dial. We'll be covering this in a later lesson on this video. And then you'll notice over here we have the left rear control wheel and the right rear control wheel. And you'll notice that the right rear control wheel has a little post in it that we can push up and down. This will lock this dial to prevent it from turning. Now, default, when you get the camera, if you are shooting in manual mode, the front control wheel will be your aperture. The rear left control wheel will be your shutter speed. Now, the right rear control wheel will change something called exposure compensation when we are on the P, A, or S modes. Don't worry about those terms. We'll cover them a little bit later. You'll notice that we have a red circle. This is the video record button, which allows us to start and stop video recording. And you'll also see that we have some buttons with the letter C in front of them. C stands for customizable. And we can customize all these buttons to do different things. I'm just explaining what the default is. C2, as the default, will allow us to choose different focusing clusters. So right here, we have our hot shoe, which is where we will connect different types of accessories. But on most cameras, this is for an external flash, which will add tons of light to your shooting environment. We cover a very affordable flash. I recommend the Godox TT685S when you're first getting started, simply because they're affordable and sometimes you may not know how serious you want to get. It's a good flash. I think they run about 120 bucks and the transmitter is like 70 bucks, but I cover the basics of flash use on the crash course. And I always seem to lose these. These are the hot shoe protectors. If you're not using your hot shoe, it makes sense just to protect it. Again, from the rear view, this is our shooting mode. We have a stills camera, we have a video camera. We also have something called S&Q, which is slow and quick. That's a video shooting mode. We'll cover a lot of that on the crash course, those video shooting techniques. But for now, we're going to leave it on the photo shooting mode. You'll also notice that the camera's fallen asleep. If I touch a shutter button, it'll wake back up. Taking a look at some of these back controls, over here we have a C3, customizable 3. Default, this is going to be your focusing modes. We'll talk about that in the focusing lesson. We have our menu, which refers to our deep menu. Lots of information in here we'll be covering in the second half of the video. We have our C1 button, which default is going to be white balance. And you'll also notice down here the trash can icon has the letters C4 next to it, which is a customizable button when we are shooting. So we can customize this in different ways. So obviously these buttons here on the bottom, we have play to play an image. And then when an image is being played, if we wanted to delete it, we would just select delete. I kind of prefer to just reformat my memory cards. I really don't do a lot of deleting from the back of the camera unless I know it's really bad. Let's talk about some of these other very important controls. So right next to where our right thumb would rest, we have the AF on, which is for back button focusing, the preferred shooting method for most professional sport shooters that I know. They prefer to focus using this instead of the shutter button. You will also notice that there is a little magnification plus icon. So if we are playing an image and we want to zoom in, we can zoom in this way, tap the shutter button to get back to shooting. AEL stands for Auto Exposure Lock, which is going to lock our exposure settings in the P, A, or S mode. It doesn't really apply to manual because manual is exposure locked all the time. It's basically what it is. But you'll also notice up here we have this little grid pattern, which will be useful to see multiple images if you want to see stacks of images during your playback. So in a playback mode, if we're playing an image and we want to see the stacks, here they are. If we push it again, now we can navigate by different sets of dates or types of files. Pretty cool using the joystick, right? So the joystick is super useful for navigating menus. You can also use it to change where your focusing square is. We're in an auto focusing mode now, so I'm going to change this to, let's say, a spot focus. And now you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see this little white box that I'm moving around. Very useful and comes in handy at certain times. This directional pad here actually has multiple controls in it. It is a rotating wheel, so you can see I rotate this wheel to the left or right, and I can also push on the wheel to access some of these features, and I can also push in the center. The center is like a set or an enter button on a computer when you want to accept something or select that menu item. Each direction has a different icon, so very important here. On Sony cameras, its default ISO control is pushing to the right, and now we can rotate up and down to change our ISO setting. If we want to change the display, we would push up and toggle through the different displays. I'll be explaining all of this in just a minute. If we want to access our drive modes, we will push to the left. The drive modes are what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way, whether it's a burst or a timer. We're talking about those two. Most of these controls are customizable, which is something that's great about Sony cameras. You may get into a certain shooting style and prefer, your exposure controls in different places. For the sake of simplicity in this video, we're going to stick with the default. A very important button here is the FN button, which pulls up the function menu when you're shooting. So when you're shooting, this is represented with 12 boxes, also customizable. We can customize these in different ways. But it allows us to access the secondary and the tertiary controls of the camera, the features that you might not change that much, for example, like the metering mode or, your record settings, quality settings, if you want a quick access to that. Now, there is another FN screen which can be accessed by pushing up on the display button until we get to this black screen. I just call it the black screen. And we can access these items here by pushing the FN button and scrolling over each of them. We'll be talking about this a little bit later. Something I would strongly recommend is to get into the habit of toggling through your different displays by pushing up on the up button. Just practice this. We sometimes get emails or comments from people saying, hey, I got this black screen. How do I get out of it? You're going to push up on your directional pad. Another cool thing I need to point out is this little infrared device right here just below the viewfinder. The viewfinder is essentially a TV. But this little switch is that when you get a thumb or a finger or your face in front of this switch, it's going to turn off the monitor. And if you're not aware of what's happening, it can be really kind of confusing. This is a battery saving feature, and what it's doing is that it's allowing the camera to toggle the screen inside when we lift it up to our eye. That's right. So when we're looking through this, it's automatically going to shut off the screen. We can also customize the screens to work in different ways. For example, when I demonstrate gimbal shooting on the crash course, I want this to stay on all the time, and I will toggle that to stay on even if there's something in front of this infrared switch. A lot of it depends on what you're doing, but we can determine how these work. So just to the right of the viewfinder, you're going to see a rotating wheel. You can access it by using the tip of a finger. And this is going to change the focus of the viewfinder, meaning what you see with your eyeball. So if you have corrective eyewear, this will allow you to adjust the focus. Sometimes that's confusing for new beginners, like, hey, everything's blurry. This is where you adjust it. A couple other icons I wanted to point out is this Wi-Fi drop feature. So if you're playing back an image and you want to drop it to your phone to share on social media, it's saying, do you want to send just this image or just this date, filtered images? We'll talk about this a little bit more in the Wi-Fi lesson. And another feature up here is the key icon. Is a protection, which means we cannot delete it from the card. We can still reformat, but this would prevent accidental deletions. So if you knew you took an amazing picture and you didn't want to accidentally delete it, you would use the key icon. Our back monitor will behave similarly to how smartphones work. So if I play an image and I want to zoom in, I'm pinching out with my fingers. I can touch and drag across the image. I can pinch together to zoom out. For the longest time, the menus were not touch sensitive, and they finally are. This is an amazing usability feature that Sony's put into their cameras recently. Very thankful for that. It makes it a lot easier to navigate. Just keep in mind, the screen is touch sensitive. We can even use it to help focus as we look through the viewfinder. There's a bunch of cool things that we can do with it, but just keep this in mind. I do recommend putting on a screen protector, and I will demonstrate that on the crash course. It's pretty straightforward. Let's talk about our ports on the left side of the camera. They're under these rubber grips that you kind of have to put your fingernail in to move and open. So on the very top, the red one, think of red for record. That is for our microphone, for an external microphone you're plugging into the camera. The camera has built-in microphones, but the problem is that as we handle the camera, those vibrations get into the mic and it sounds terrible. And typically the microphone's not directional. It's not that great. I sell a basic microphone for $50 on my website. You can find it on Amazon. It's the Maven mic. If you're just getting started and you need a directional microphone, it's the one I've personally tested. We put it head to head against tons of other microphones. As you get into more professional work, you're going to invest hundreds or even thousands of dollars into high-end production microphones that are really good. For example, I'm wearing a Sennheiser E100. It's a lav mic. Why? Because this is my job. So if you're not really sure about how serious you're going to get, I would say start off with something like the Maven mic, and then as you get more serious and you're using it more, then you would want lav mics or production quality ones. This is where we plug it in. We also have a headphone jack just below it, which I also recommend if you're doing video recording, because you want to hear the audio quality. Even this morning as I was setting up on my other camera, I was listening to the audio coming through the microphone and it was all staticky. One of the cables had gone bad and I replaced it. So you always want to check and monitor your audio. This is where we plug our headset in. The USB-C terminal can be used for different things, including charging your camera if you wanted to charge the battery in camera. If you don't have a charger, it's the only way to do it. It's nice to have as a backup. There's no indicator light, but if you look at the battery, when you plug that USB-C cable in and it's charging, you will see a little plug indicator right next to the battery. I want to take you on an overview of the different types of shooting information that we'll see, and this is why I had you toggle on the display button up. I am in the manual mode, and obviously we have tons of different icons and they can be very confusing. So to simplify it in the beginning, I want you to pay attention to these sets of information on the bottom, and I'm going to rotate the aperture wheel to see that. So you can see as I'm rotating the front control wheel is that the F number is changing. So this number, any number with the F, is the aperture. That deals with the size of the opening of the lens. The one next to it that I'm rotating with the left control wheel changes our shutter speed, and this is given as a fraction, 1/20th of a second, 1/25th of a second. We'll be talking about exposure a little bit later. Over here to the far right, we have our ISO control. So we can go up and down by toggling this over here, ISO. So these three settings, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, are critically important to determining the brightness of the image. Now, when you're on the manual mode, your exposure compensation isn't really an exposure compensation. So I'm going to flip this over. Now, this fourth icon here, it has a plus minus sign in a square with a diagonal, and it says plus minus 0. This deals with our exposure compensation, and you will not see this control available on the manual mode. But you'll notice that as I turn it one direction, the screen gets brighter, and in the other direction, the screen gets darker. Don't worry about this for right now. I'm just pointing out this is our exposure compensation control. And on this particular screen, we also have a histogram, which is a statistical representation of the brightness of the pixels. I talk about this in a lesson on the crash course. There's an intro photography course. And this square here is our focusing square. I also refer to it as a cluster. We'll be pointing these out a little bit later. But to summarize, these three settings are critically important: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. You will also see this information mirrored in the viewfinder. It's just easier for me to show it on the back monitor. As I push up on the display screen, we have a level, and I'll demonstrate this real quick, is that if I tilt the tripod down, and we can even tilt it to the left or right, and you can see that tilting. It's very useful when you're lining up on a horizon, for example. When you get everything lined up, you're going to see green across the board. I'm tilting it back up, and now I know that is straight even on the horizon. And I lock the tripod, and I use this a lot when I'm shooting landscapes, for example. If we continue to push up on the directional pad, now we're taken to the infamous, what I call the black screen. So the black screen has a tremendous amount of information. The first time you see it, it could be very intimidating. But what you will notice is that these icons pop up. They're the same icons, just in different screens. And so the black screen has pretty much all of them together, right? So we have our mode indicator, aperture priority mode. We have our shutter speed, aperture, ISO. We have our exposure compensation. And if we were to rotate it, there it is. We have a histogram on the bottom, and we have our level. We've seen these in different places already. Here we have our battery indicator, how much battery life is remaining. This is the memory card indicator. It's telling us that we're using memory card in slot 1. These are the number of pictures available for the particular setting that we're using, 5,138. Our quality settings tells us whether we're shooting in RAW or JPEG, with the compression setting of the JPEG here as fine. We have the number of megapixels the camera is shooting on. 33 megapixels is the maximum resolution of the A74. Then we have our image stabilizer for the sensor. This little hand icon is telling us that it's on. Over to the far right, you're going to see a bunch of these icons that will pop up in other places. If you wish to change these settings from this screen, you need to push the FN button, and it will allow us to do so. We have a couple here, additional ones on the bottom. We have our quality settings in image stabilization. So if we wanted direct access to the type of file that we were telling the camera to record, we could do that directly. Tap shutter button. We could also turn off our image stabilizer, also referred to as steady shots. If we hit that, it brings us into the menu, and we can go down. Something you will notice is that as we're pulled into these smaller menus, is that you will see these little triangles pointing in different directions. That just tells us we have options in those directions that you press. And we can literally move this square over different items. You'll notice that we have two exposure compensations. The bottom one is for our flash exposure compensation, which we'll cover on the crash course. But over to the far right, we have these 12 different icons. This top one is our drive mode, flash settings, focusing modes, focusing clusters, what type of shutter we're using, whether it's mechanical or electric or a hybrid of the two, face and eye autofocus. We have our viewfinder refresh rate, which deals with how many images per second we're seeing in the viewfinder. We have our memory card setting. We want to change how our memory cards are recording stills or video. We have our aspect ratio. I recommend at 3:2 for now. Our picture profiles, which is sort of like how the image is baked before it's recorded. It's usually very widely used for video. A lot of video shooters use it, but you can apply it to stills as well. This setting is referred to as the creative look, and it allows us to make general adjustments to the image, such as saturation, sharpness, contrast, things of that nature. Then we have our dynamic range optimizer, which bakes in different degrees of shading in terms of shadows and highlights. It's set to auto for now. We have our white balance, and then we have our metering mode. So that is the black FN screen. If we push up and we continue to toggle through, now we get a live view screen with many of these same settings on here. If we push the FN button, many of these items are now on the bottom. We just saw them. They're exactly the same. And we can also customize these in our menu if you want to change them up. When we change over to, for example, the video mode and press the FN button, you'll notice that these change. So this FN menu, or this function menu, changes depending on whether we're in a stills mode, shooting mode, or a video shooting mode. But in this particular screen, real quick, we have our shooting modes, drive modes, focusing modes, focusing cluster, mechanical or electronic shutter, face detection, shutter speed, aperture, exposure compensation, ISO. On the top, we have number of shots remaining, which card we're using. We have our JPEG settings, or quality settings, number of megapixels, steady shot. We have our battery life, metering mode, white balance, dynamic range optimizer, creative looks, and picture profiles. When we're on the P, A, or S mode, something you should notice is this hand icon. What it does is it gives us a warning if we start to use slow shutter speeds. It's the camera's way of saying, hey, even though this is on, the shutter speed is too slow and it might be blurry. So if I come back and, for example, let's say I stop my aperture down a little bit so the shutter speed is changing. When we get under 1/40th of a second, it starts to blink, right? It's saying, hey, beware of your handheld shutter speed because it's probably going to be blurry. And then if we change the settings so it's a faster shutter speed, it's on, and it basically is telling us you should be good to go. Over the years, the image stabilization in the camera, the sensor stabilization, and combined with certain lenses that also have image stabilization is phenomenal. It is ridiculous compared to what we had even a few years ago, where you can easily take a handheld long exposure, we're talking about like half a second handheld if you're really good. In some cases, you can lean against the wall and get a full second if you practice enough. And that is absolutely insane that you do not need a tripod in certain types of shooting situations for stills. Something I want to point out is that when I switch to video mode, you'll notice that we get a few new icons that we haven't seen before. One of the more important ones is these audio levels for our left and right channel. And you can see even as I'm talking, it's picking up my voice. This is going to be really important for controlling your audio and keeping an eye on it. Most of the icons are the same. There's a few different things. We can see the amount of time left on the memory card so I have 2 hours left of video recording at this particular resolution, frame rate, and bit depth. All of these letters and numbers here are really confusing if you've never shot a lot of video before, but they deal with the compression settings for video, the frame rate, the bit depth. It even tells us 8-bit. And there's a reason why you would want to change this. If you're a pure beginner, there's a setting I would recommend you use because the files are easier to use. It's quicker to edit on your laptop. The question I sometimes get is, can you shoot a movie with this camera? And the answer is absolutely you can. And those features, these other features of bit depth and frame rates and things of that nature will become more important as you get more serious. We cover a lot of this. In fact, we cover almost all the different shooting styles on the crash course, from blogging to documentary to narrative filmmaking. All of those examples are covered in the crash course. So if you want to get into serious video work, be sure to check it out. Most of these other settings are pretty much the same. Now, if you're shooting and you don't want to deal with all these icons, you may want to toggle up. And so we just get the exposure settings. But that is a quick overview of the different screens and icons that we will see on the camera. Something I want to point out is that on your mode dial, we have a setting that is in a green box. It says auto. Auto works in both the video mode as well as the stills mode, and I lovingly refer to this as the dummy mode. So right now we're in the dummy mode for video. If we flip over back to stills, we get the dummy mode up in the top left-hand corner. The dummy mode means that we are turning control over to the camera. The camera is going to decide the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO. All we need to worry about is taking a picture. The truth of the matter is, if you spent this much money on a camera of this nature, you're probably going to want to unlock the capabilities. I understand if you just want to take some pictures, but if this is really confusing and you just want to get out and go shooting, you could shoot on the dummy mode and get some pictures, but the power of the camera is really unlocked when we at least shoot on the P mode. So even if you want to shoot on the dummy mode, I would still recommend going with the P mode because it's going to give us some control over the camera. But in this next lesson, we're going to talk about the focusing systems. And if you are not at least in the P mode, you're not going to see a lot of these things. So if you're in the green mode and you're trying to, say, for example, change your focusing cluster, it's not going to allow you to do that. So I always recommend, even if you're just starting out, go with the P mode. And I really, really strongly recommend going to the A mode. We'll talk about that in a minute. Something I need to point out is that I have my camera turned to spot M. By default, when you get the camera, it's going to be on the wide. So if you don't have this mode set up, you're going to be confused as to what I'm doing. Basically, you're going to push C2, focusing areas, and I want you to select spot M for the sake of this demonstration. When we talk about the camera's focusing systems, I really like to break it down into the how, the when, and the where. How, when, where. If you remember those three things, this is going to be easy. So how do we focus with the camera? As I've already demonstrated, we're going to take our index finger, halfway shutter button depression. We get a focus lock indicated with this green dot and this focusing box here. We hear an audio signal, and the camera is telling us that this is in focus. Push it down all the way to take the picture. So that is the basic way most cameras will focus. Now, there is another focusing button on the back of the camera that says AF on. When we push this, we can also achieve a focusing lock. So how do we focus? Halfway shutter button depression or the AF on button. And there's some other ways we'll talk about in just a minute. So let's talk about the when the camera is focusing, whether this is a one-time focus or whether it's a continuous focus over and over again. That refers to the camera's focusing modes, and they can be accessed by default by pressing the C3 button. And when you come in here, you'll see that we actually have several focusing modes. There's 5 of them, but I don't want you to get concerned with that. Just think of it in terms of how often the camera is focusing. Autofocus single was what I just demonstrated. And if we select that, what it means is the camera will achieve focusing lock one time and one time only, which means that if we push and hold the shutter button halfway down, we can move the camera and the focus plane will not change. It'll stay in that position. The camera is not updating the focus. We can move it in any direction as long as we're halfway shutter button depressed. We're good to go. It is locked on AFS, which stands for autofocus single. Now, this can be very useful for a technique called recomposing, and I'll demonstrate this when I teach you portrait shooting on the crash course, is that sometimes you'll get a focusing lock on a subject, but you want to move the camera to make it more aesthetically pleasing in terms of your composition. And this is the technique of recomposing. Focus lock, halfway shutter button depression, I'm keeping it held down and I'm moving the camera, push it down all the way to take the picture. That is only done with AFS. And there's tons of different techniques that we'll talk about. So the next focusing type I want to talk about is continuous autofocus. Now you're going to notice something different when I push the shutter button halfway down. first of all, there's no beep. And second of all, we get these little green parentheses around the green dot. And another thing is as I move the cameras will update the focus on the box. The focal plane is not locked. And this is going to be better for moving subjects. Autofocus continuous means that as long as the focusing box is on the target and the focusing is engaged, the camera will update the focusing over and over and over again. Whereas autofocus single is really better for subjects that don't move. They're sitting still. Maybe it's cooperating human. So you can already see we have different focusing types depending on our subject matter. If they're still, we're going to go with autofocus single. If they're moving, we're probably going to want to go with autofocus continuous. The third focusing type is a hybrid of the first two, automatic autofocus. And the truth of the matter is I almost never use this. The idea is that the camera will basically assist you. If the subject isn't moving, it chooses autofocus single. If the subject is moving, it should be able to jump into this autofocus continuous, but usually when I'm in those situations, I just shoot with autofocus continuous and don't even cross my fingers, so to speak. So those are the first three major focusing types. The fourth one you should definitely know about is simply manual focus. And what this means is that when we push a shutter button down, nothing happens. We're not focusing at all, but we can rotate the focusing ring and you'll see it punch in like this. And I can focus on this target and get precise focusing lock. In fact, just a minute ago, I had a question on one of my Facebook groups. Somebody was shooting a video of a performance on a stage. She's like, what focusing mode should I use? And I said, well, you're going to want to turn your focus off. You're going to focus on the stage and turn your focusing off because you don't want the camera jumping around and guessing, if it's a static shot. So if you do that, this will allow you to pick the precise focusing point of where you want to focus. Now, this direct manual zoom feature can be done in a number of different ways. But when you are on manual focus and you start moving the focusing ring, it will jump in. And there's a way to turn that off when we talk about the deep menu. I think it's a very useful tool. The fifth and last focusing mode is direct manual focus. It's like a hybrid between single focus and manual focus. So the idea on this is that I push the shutter button halfway down, I get my focusing lock, and then I can adjust it by rotating the focusing ring on the lens. So this allows me to get really precise. This particular focusing method is going to be great for people like, let's say, macro photographers, where they need a really precise focusing lock. They want to get a general focus and then really dial it in. So that is the when the camera is focusing, whether it's a one-time, continuous, manual, or some type of hybrid between those. So we've talked about the how, we've talked about the when. Now let's talk about the where the camera is focusing. This deals with the camera's focusing clusters, and there are a ton of them. It can get really confusing. So as I already pointed out, the camera's focusing squares can be found by pushing C2 by default, and you can see that we have tons of these different focusing squares, and I'm going to go through each of them real quick. Focus area wide means that we are turning control over the focusing area to the camera. And what will happen is the camera will look for a point of contrast in the case we have this little plus focusing target against white blinds, and the camera can pick it up really quick and easy. So it's a combination of contrast as well as distance to the camera. So if you get something that's closer to the camera might choose that, or it might choose the mark. And because of this, it's kind of hard to control where focus is happening. And the only time I really use something like this is maybe birds in flight, a dark contrast bird on a bright sky. It works pretty good for stuff like that. But for most of the time, I don't really use the wide focusing area for the type of work that I do. The next focusing cluster is referred to as zone. And you will notice that we get these 4 little corner marks. And we can move those corner marks around by pushing on the joystick. For me personally, I think it's a lot easier just to, use the joystick to move the boxes around. But the idea of this is that we can limit the area that we're telling the camera to look in. So instead of looking at the full screen, it's looking in a smaller area, again, for a point of contrast, so we have a little bit more control. The third cluster is center, and this is a fixed focusing point. It's just in the center of the screen with these four, and it will not change. So if you know that you're going to be shooting from the center of the screen and you don't want it changing anywhere else, go with the center focusing cluster. So next we have the spot focusing cluster. I think it's super useful. I use it all the time. This is the medium size, and you notice that we can basically move the box to 80% or so of the viewfinder, basically tell the camera, hey, only focus in this area, and it does a really good job of that. When we come in to select these clusters, we can also pick a small box. This would be good for precise focusing. Macro shooters, very wide apertures, things of that nature. If the medium and small are too, they don't cover enough area, we can go with large and we get a larger box. I use the large box probably 60-70% of the time when I am using a single focusing square, and it allows me to get more precise. The next focusing cluster is something called expandable spot. It's sort of like a hybrid where it's prioritizing in a smaller box, but it also gives permission to look around that box as well. So you get focus there, we move it outside. It's one of these things where it's kind of an extreme niche type of shooting that it would become useful. I pretty much don't use it. The last cluster is tracking expand spot. So when I pick this, you can see that it's grayed out. Camera doesn't want to allow me to select it, what's going on. If we are in the wrong shooting mode, which is direct manual focus right now, it doesn't like it. So we pick continuous focus here. Come back into our clusters. I'm pressing C2 on top of the camera. And now we have this tracking expandable spot shooting. And you can notice that we can come to the left or right. We can apply tracking to any of the focusing clusters in this bottom menu. So this determines that we're tracking, and this determines which cluster we're using. So if I wanted to demonstrate it with tracking wide, I'm going to select that. And now we get a different box. It's like a square with two lines on the side. Over the years, Sony has improved this dramatically, and it does a phenomenal job of tracking most of the time. It does better when you're locked onto a single subject, with not a lot of front action moving in front of it. Maybe certain types of running athletes. As long as it has that lock, it does really, really well, but it can be confused. And the idea on this is that you would just get your focusing lock, see the thumb button, there it goes, and you're holding this down, and it's going to track that subject wherever it goes in the frame. Don't expect it to be perfect. If you get 70 to 80% keepers, you should be thrilled. And we can even change the type of square that we're using by changing on the bottom there. So we can change each of the different clusters with a different type of tracking. Even the center will go off center. And that's another arrow in your quiver. So we've talked about the how, the when, and the where of your camera's core focusing systems. But because we're dealing with a very sophisticated camera, a very powerful camera, there are additional ways to focus. Obviously, we have this touch screen. It's sensitive to touch, and we want to make sure that this is turned on for this example. Coming into the deep menu, yellow tab on the bottom, touch operation is on. We can come into the deep menu to do these settings, but I think there's an easier way. So you'll notice this icon says off, but in the deep menu it says on. So if we come into the deep menu and turn this off, what it means is that we've turned off the touch screen altogether, that there's no way we could turn that back on unless we come into the menu. So we're going to turn this on, which means the touch screen is now sensitive, but we have some additional controls here with this little button here in the top right hand corner. So right now it's telling us that the touch focus is off. Even though the touch screen is still working, this touch focus is off. But if we push it, let's see if we can get it. Now we have the ability to change where our focusing square is. And I'm using my hand to demonstrate that it's not focusing on my hand. It's not focusing on the blinds. It's just moving the focusing square. And then when we push and engage, Too close, maybe. There is the green lock. So if we're on autofocus single and we're moving this square around like this, we would still have to engage the autofocus. You can continue to toggle it, and we get this tracking. And it's a little confusing because this is not what autofocus single does. So using my hand, if I push here, now we're actually getting a tracking mode, even with autofocus single. Pretty cool. And if I wanted to go here, it would go here. Now, the problem with the tracking is sometimes it's a little jumpy. It'll jump around on something that maybe I didn't really want, but it's pretty cool when it works. It's not perfect. See, it's a little confused with the blinds. And we can also cancel the tracking by pressing this little box with the X icon or pressing our set button, and it's canceled. And if we were to push it again, now we're to the off position. So that is how we can use the back monitor for touch focusing with autofocus single. Now these touch focusing modes will also work the same if we were in AFA or AFC. And the idea, I believe, is to have these shortcut methods to jump into, let's say, choosing where your focusing square is, or having, for example, a tracking point without needing to change your focusing modes. It's a little confusing at first, but definitely worth practicing and getting used to because these focusing tools change depending on what we're shooting. Let's talk about eye detection. And by now, you probably know the A74 is capable of amazing focusing by choosing the eyeball of a human, an animal, or a bird. Now, a word of warning, this is one of the most common questions I see in my Facebook group is about how come I'm not getting 100% eye detection focus, for example. And the truth of the matter is it's never going to be perfect. It's going to work better with humans. But when we think about the number of animals out there in the shapes of their faces and the textures and the movement with the patterns in the background, the camera is not perfect. It's not always going to be able to detect a face perfectly. Even humans, I've never seen it at 100% accurate. It is very, very good. It makes our life easier, but I want you to lower your expectations just a little bit for eye detection when we're talking about using this feature. It's a learning algorithm. It's going to get better with time, but I think it's going to be a while before it's 100% perfect, maybe a long time. So I just ask that you temper your expectations. Now, by default, when you get the camera, face detection is going to be on already. At least mine was. So eye detection works depending on the focusing cluster we have. So if this is wide, anywhere it sees a face, it's going to work. When we get something to a zone, we're telling the camera to only look in the zone for that eye detection. See, it's looking for an eye detection here. It's not finding it. But when we have the human within that frame, now we get eye detection. So that's something to keep in mind, is that eye detection is looking within the square we have designated for our focusing clusters. So depending on the size of that, if I go to, let's say, spot focus and I'm over here, it's not going to recognize eye detection. Now there is a problem with this, is that sometimes you are going to want to focus away from the person. And if you have a focusing square that says look for eye detection, let's say we're in something like this, something like zone. Let's say we want to focus over here. Well, now the camera is focusing where we don't want to. So I'm going to demonstrate how to customize the A74 in such a way that when you are shooting with your squares, you're just shooting for area. But a quick control shortcut for eye autofocus that I have customized on almost all of my other Sony cameras. So this is just the first customization I'm recommending. I think it makes it easier for me. I'm coming into the deep menu, purple tab, page 3, face and eye autofocus. By default, mine was turned on, yours might be too, and what I'm going to do is to turn that to off, meaning that when I focus now, it's focusing on areas of contrast. It's not looking for the eye. But people will say, Michael, that was such a cool feature, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to customize the set button, this button right here, or maybe you want it on the auto exposure lock button. I'm going to put face detection here, so when I'm shooting and I want eye detection, I can hit this. And if I don't want it, then I would do my normal focusing. And it gives me a lot more control over it. So I'm going to come down to the yellow tab, and I'm going to go to Operation Customize. Still is the camera, Custom Key. And this is where we can customize how our buttons operate. You can see that it gives us a little picture of the camera and a little white highlight next to the button that we want to change its operation. I don't recommend this very much to beginning and intermediate shooters because you're still learning the camera, but the focusing thing is the one I do because it gives you more control. And we're going to come down to the set button, and you can see that the set button is not set. I'm going to select that, and what the camera is now asking is, what function do you want to put there? So I'm going to come back. It looks like we're in the deep menu, but it's not. It's asking, what feature do you want to customize? I'm going to come to page 3, face and eye detection, and then I'm just going to turn on eye autofocus. So now eye autofocus is ready to go where the set button is. And you can put it up here on the auto exposure lock if you don't use that button. I kind of like having my white balance here and these other C buttons where they are. But once this is done, I'm going to come back out. And now when I push the set button, I am jumping into eye detection, which means I can focus here for the focusing square, or I can focus to the eye detection. And it gives me a lot more control over precisely where the focusing is. For example, if I'm shooting a sporting event and people are running around, I might be going with a focusing box. But if they stop and pause and I get a shot to jump on their eye, then I can do it that way. And for me personally, that's the way I like to shoot. This gives us powerful controls over regular focusing versus eye detection. When we get into the deep menu, I'll cover the most important stuff in this video. When we talk about eye detection, there is a number of other settings in here. And we can prioritize for animals, left or right eye. There's a huge number of settings. We can even have a face memory. So if I had a child at a birthday party and I wanted the camera to try to recognize the pattern of my child's face, we could register those faces. But for now, just focus on the core focusing and the eye detection. Let's talk about face detection when we are shooting video. There's a setting in here that's really going to make this a lot easier. Strongly recommend turning this on. We're going to come into our purple tab, page 3. Something else you'll notice is that when we're in the video icon mode, we get this little video camera icon. And what we're going to do is to turn on the face and eye frame display. If this is not turned on, you will not be able to really tell when the camera is focusing on a person's face. So we're going to turn this to on, tap the shutter button, and when we come back out, we get this little white focusing box on our model's eye. So this tells us what the camera is focusing on and it's tracking, right? Again, we still have these touch controls that we talked about earlier, but face detection for video is amazing, especially if you're doing vlogging and you're moving around a little bit and you want the camera to follow you. It does an incredible job. And the question will then come, well, what if we have, maybe a subject in our foreground that we want to focus on instead of the eye? So if I move my hand in front of the camera, now it's focused on the hand, and now it's jumping back onto the face. So it's giving the camera permission to jump on to face detection. Now, remember when we talked about this little guy right here? These controls work in video as well, and they can be very, very handy. Let's say we have a person here and we're trying to do something called a rack focus, where the attention needs to be shifted from here to here, for example. Well, I can push on my hand. What this does is it tells the camera to focus on where you touch instead of the face detection. We know this because when we push the display up and we come back to this information panel, watch here, now it's on manual focus. So I push on the model's face, it jumps to autofocus, continuous, and then manual focus. So this is how we can rack focus without needing a camera assistant. There's people in Hollywood, this is all they do, is they have a rig on the lens and they're manually adjusting these rings. And by touching on the screen, we don't need to do those things. We also have the ability to turn off this feature, this touch feature. So if I hit this, now we're back in face detection. So that is a really cool way to jump between face detection, touch focus. You can just do it, and then jumping back into face detection again. Very powerful focusing techniques. Now there's another one I want to show you, which is referred to as peaking focus. So to do this, we're going to jump over to manual, and we're going to come into the menu. So in the menu, we're going to come into peaking display, and you can see that it's turned off. We're going to turn this to on, and we're going to turn the level. Let's just turn it up to high. And for color, I kind of like red because it stands out. We're turning peaking on, touch shutter button, and now we get this red kind of outline when there are areas of contrast. So in manual focus, this is a very powerful way to see exactly where the focal plane is, and used a lot for video shooting. So you can see that as I change the focus in the manual focus, when we have the area of the most red, is that when we have the area of greatest contrast, it's telling us this is where the focal plane is. If we wanted to zoom in on this, we could come into purple tab, Focus Assistant, Focus Magnifier. We press Change Magnification, and then it jumps in. There's a lot of steps to kind of get to this, and the way it's set up right now is my autofocus on is eye detection, but I have it here, right? So I would customize this to be my focus magnifier. If I wanted to do that real quick, why not? Come in here. So customize operations. For video shooting, I want it to magnify, just as an example. It's going to be, right now it's following the custom of the camera. I'm going to change this to focus magnifier in video. So now if I want to jump in, there we go. It's a quick way to set that up. Video focusing is a little different. So when I'm in the video mode, I can use this as my autofocus on button. If we get off of that, and then in the video mode, now it's a magnifier. But that is an overview of peaking. We can change the colors on it as well if we wanted to. Blue, there it is. I'm going to turn this to off. And another thing I want to point out is that if you press your FN button, we have a shortcut to our peaking display right here. And that is an overview of peaking focus. Something else I want to point out, that in the event you needed a quick zoom in, you could hit this right away, and you could use a manual zoom technique. If you are in manual focus, just hit this. Even without peaking, it'll work. So you have to be in manual focus for that. So we've discussed tons of different ways to focus, both in stills as well as in video. Very common question. Can you use peaking focus in stills? Well, there's manual. Let's turn it on. There it is. So on some cameras you cannot, but now we have the ability to use peaking focus in both video as well as stills. Briefly, let's talk about white balance. White balance by default can be accessed with your C1 button right here. I have this set up customized for the recording, but when you get it default, it's probably going to be set on auto white balance. And for the most part, this is going to be fine. White balance is one of these things that you might not really want to worry about until maybe you're an intermediate shooter and you have your focusing and your composition and your exposure settings down. So in the beginning, auto white balance is fine when you're just starting to get used to your camera. Now, what will happen is you'll be shooting and you'll notice the color will be off when you look at the images. Maybe it's a person and there's like maybe a bluish tone, or maybe it's too yellow. This deals with our white balance. Suffice it to say, the human eye is amazing. It can make all kinds of adjustments in different kinds of lights, types of lights, brightnesses of lights. camera sensors are not quite like that. And the heart of the matter is that light sources give off different colors according to what the type of light is. So if you have your camera set for, let's say, the sunlight, and you're shooting indoors in incandescent light, you are going to see this color shift that is very unpleasing. So the way we control this, there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is when we see these color shifts, we want to select the icon that correlates to the shooting environment we're in. So if we're shooting in the sun, we would want to have this sun icon, daylight. Or if we were shooting in shade, we would want the shade icon. You'll also notice the color of the monitor is changing. It's giving me a preview of what the image would look like. If we're shooting in cloud cover, we would want the cloud icon. If we were shooting in incandescent light bulbs, we would want the light bulb icon. And then we have fluorescent types of lights. We also have flash. If we're using an external flash, we would have the flash. Sony cameras are pretty cool that they have a setting for underwater auto white balance. We have a Kelvin setting that I'll demonstrate in just a second. And we also have 3 custom white balances, and I'll show you how to set each of these up in a second. But the short answer is if you're shooting and it looks weird, the color is off, it's either too blue or too yellow, it's probably because our white balance is not selected correctly. Again, I don't really recommend worrying about it until it starts to bother you and you see it regularly. In the meantime, just shoot with auto white balance. There's actually a lot more to white balance than, just select the icon. Is that if we push the directional pad to the right, we have this color gamut which allows us to shift the white balance in different directions, how the auto white balance is working. I definitely do not recommend doing this unless you're an advanced shooter, you're an expert shooter, and for the most part, I never use it with the exception of a Panasonic camera that I have that does need white balance tweaking. Other than that, I never use this color shift. So I'm gonna hit cancel. Let's take a look at the custom white balance. Custom white balance assumes that we are shooting in a mixed lighting condition and we are able to tell the camera something like these white blinds. This is white. Please adjust the camera settings to this. So I have it selected to custom 1. I'm going to hit the set button. It gives me this square. And then I'm going to capture that using the set button. It's going to capture what I'm telling the camera is white, and we get a beautiful neutral tone here, at least from where I'm seeing it. Looks a little bit different on the camera that I'm recording. But this is like perfectly neutral to me. It's telling me it's at 5,000 Kelvin, and I'm going to hit OK, and then I would continue shooting in this shooting environment. You can do it with a bride's dress, a white wall, a white ceiling, a gray card, any neutral color in a mixed lighting condition, you can custom white balance. Custom white balance is typically used for things like on location types of video shooting where you have mixed light conditions, or it's just you have incandescent and fluorescent and maybe you're in the shade a little bit, so it's like really weird. So we're going to talk about the Kelvin temperature. I'm going to go into it a little bit deeper. I talk about it on the lighting crash course that I have. The short answer is that the camera Kelvin temperature, we can move it up and down, and you can see it's getting more and more orange. And as we turn it down, it's getting more and more blue, right? And when I explain this to people, they usually get pretty angry with me, and I get people arguing with me. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just telling you what's going on with the camera. The Kelvin setting allows us to tell the camera the color temperature that we are shooting in. And it's very confusing because there's 2 terminologies that are used that conflict with each other. So when I see a blue image, this can be referred to as being very cool. It's a cool color tone. And when you see the tones leaning to, let's say, orange or yellow, this can be described as a very warm tone. But something you'll notice is that the temperature for Kelvin is high here. This is a very hot temperature, right? And this is a very low temperature, right? The blue. So you're like, okay, yeah, that's pretty straightforward, no problem, right? Well, what's happening is the camera is adding a different color. It's adding the opposite color of the Kelvin we're shooting in. So for example, if I had a candle, well, a candle has a yellow flame. In a candle, Kelvin temperature is very low. And there's a whole science behind this, which is far beyond the scope of this video, but suffice it to say that light given at different temperatures has different color hues, right? So if you see a candle and you're saying, hey, that's yellow, what the camera is doing is it's adding blue into the scene to counteract the yellow. And if you're looking at something like a blowtorch, like a blue blowtorch that's really, really hot, well, now the camera would add yellow in to counterbalance the blue. And that is what's happening on all of the white balance settings, the Kelvin settings, is the camera is adding the opposite color in to make the image neutral. So very, very high Kelvin temperatures are actually blue. And this is where everybody gets confused. And you're like, no, that doesn't make any sense. It should be orange. No, the hotter Kelvin temperatures are blue. The camera is adding in yellow to counteract it. And the lower Kelvin temperatures are actually yellow, and the camera is adding in blue. That's probably more information than you wanted. I just wanted to kind of explain to you what was happening with white balance. But again, as I said before, if you're just starting, go on auto white balance and change it once you see this color shift. Color temperature in your picture styles and all that stuff is really pretty important for video. You can save a lot when you're dealing with raw images. There's a lot of information in there. Even JPEGs can be processed pretty well. It's the video shooting you got to be really careful about your auto white balance, your picture styles. All of those things should be dialed in. We'll be talking about those on the crash course. So the next feature I want to talk about is your drive modes. Just going over them real quick. Your drive modes tell the camera what to do after we push the shutter button down all the way. So in the case of single shooting, we're telling the camera to take one single picture. In the case of continuous shooting high, we have a number of options here designated with the triangle. We can come over, we can pick medium, low, high, high plus. So if we're doing high plus with a mechanical shutter, right, it's pretty quick. So think of continuous shooting as rapid fire for sports. If you don't want the full burst, you would turn it down to medium or a low. Just depends on what you're doing. When we're talking about a timer, we have a little 10 seconds next to it. So we can change the amount of time between the timer. So if we wanted a 2-second shot versus a 10-second shot, we could do that. If we come down, now we have the ability to choose how long and the number of images. 10 seconds, 3 images. 5 seconds, 5 images. So if you're doing, let's say, a group photo and you're worried about people having their eyes closed while they're blinking, you might want to do this. We also have the ability to bracket our shots. A continuous bracketing basically means that if we choose this, let's pick something here obvious. So we're going to go 1 exposure value for 3 images. And what this does, it gives us a bracket indicator. Push the shutter button down. If you hold it down, it'll take all 3 images. And when you play it back, you can see the camera automatically changed the exposure setting of the shutter speed between each shot. Bracketed shots are classically done in landscape shooting or a situation where you have varying tones of brightness and darkness, and you want to capture all those details. Coming back in, we have single bracket feature. I'll do this once and see if you can listen to see. So you have to push the button down separately for each one instead of pushing and holding. It's the difference between those two. Now we can bracket also with our white balance between high and low. So it'll do a shift for the white balance. And then we can shift with our dynamic range optimizer, high or low as well. So that is your drive modes. The ones you're really going to be using is between single shooting and continuous and maybe the timer. A quick way to jump into electronic shutter, if you wanted to just go with electronic shutter, we could come in here, hit the FN button, and go to electronic. Now, something I need to point out is that if you're going in pure electronic mode, and let's do this. Let me use a faster shutter speed. I'm going to bump up my ISO a ton so you can see this. and I take a picture. Now I'm shooting with LED lights, and if you see this, this is very typical when shooting with an electronic shutter with LED lights, is you get this banding. It's just a phenomena of flickering lights. I even have a video on flickering lights if you want to understand what's going on, but suffice it to say, LEDs are flickering very quickly, and when we use an electronic shutter, we get these kinds of patterns. The only way around it is to go either back to mechanical shutter or to change your shutter speed down to 1/125th of a second or less. It's almost gone. I can see some faint marks of it because we're just over the magic shutter speed. But in any event, if we shoot in video, we can see the same thing if we're using a very fast shutter speed. Let me open this up, and you can see this banding in real time. There it is. You can see it kind of moving up. Same rules with video, is we want to be at that 1/60th of a second, and it should resolve most of it. Something like that. My ISO's turned up way too high. So banding, if you see it, that's what's going on. It's with an electronic shutter. So now we're going to start getting into exposure control on the still setting. Triple check to make sure that we have our live view display set correctly. We're going to go into the red tab in our menu. Shooting display, it's number 10, in live view display set. We want to make sure that the setting effect is on for the demonstration that I'm about to give. Now, if you're doing studio flash, you may want to come in here and turn this off because flash is adding a lot of extra light. This is where you would come in and change this. But for this demonstration, make sure that the effect is set to on. Otherwise, it's not going to work, what I'm about to show you. So it should be set to that by default. We are about to go over the mode dial, how it changes the behavior of the camera, the different modes. You're going to see a P, A, S, and M, and some numbers. And then we're going to talk about changing the exposure controls, probably the most important lesson on this whole video. It's so critical. And at the end of that, I'm going to talk about ISO, what it is and how it works. Again, just remember, you can jump back to review any of these lessons at any time. I would highly recommend you have your camera in hand to follow along. So I am rotating the mode dial, and there's an indicator on the viewfinder, that white little tick mark, that when we line up the tick mark with the mode, we can see which mode we're on right here in the top corner. So here's the dummy mode. That's pretty much everything's automatic, almost everything. And then we have the P, A, S, and M modes. Then we have these numbered modes. It'll basically, it's a way to customize. So if you do a lot of sports shooting, you would want to set those settings onto the 1 mode or the 2 mode or the 3 mode, and you could just jump to them. That's what they are. And pretty much nothing else, right? So this mode dial basically means that we can tell the camera, hey, I want you to control certain aspects of it, and I want to control other aspects. And the exposure settings change differently depending on what mode we're in. So the easiest way for me to explain this with exposure control is to start with the aperture priority mode. This is the mode that I would strongly recommend that you focus on learning because it's going to give you a ton of mileage. As a professional wedding photographer, as a sports shooter, I typically use aperture priority mode. Even in the most professional settings, I will use aperture priority mode for a very specific reason. So aperture priority mode tells the camera that we are changing the aperture. That's what it means. So we change the aperture by default by rotating the front control wheel. And we can see that indicated with this orange number, F, as it changes. Apertures are often very confusing for beginners. The short definition is that smaller numbers mean the opening of the lens is larger. Larger numbers mean that the lens opening is smaller and it's letting in less light. So if you see a f20, that's a very small opening. If you see an f1, it's a very large opening. And if you were interested in the math, it's basically the focal length of the lens divided by the opening size of the lens in millimeters. That's how we get these numbers. So I can change the aperture size, but you'll notice something. The brightness is not changing. It's flickering a little bit, but it's pretty much the same brightness after a second, right? How is that even possible? If I am making a lens opening smaller and smaller and letting in less and less light, it should be getting darker. So what's happening here is the camera is adjusting the shutter speed. As I make that aperture smaller and smaller, the camera is using a longer and a longer shutter speed to compensate for the smaller aperture size. The camera is trying to help us. So aperture priority mode means we dial in the aperture and the camera dials in the shutter speed. Now, I often get this question what are the settings I need for XYZ kind of shooting? And I can never answer it because I don't know how much light is in your shooting environment. It changes depending on how much light you have, what kind of shooting you're doing, and I can't just give these blanket statements, right? So I want you to do an exercise with me, and I'm going to prove this to you, how good the camera is at changing its shutter speed. I want you to take your hand and slowly block the amount of light coming into the camera, and you'll notice the shutter speed is increasing. Putting your hand in front of and taking it away, the camera is still doing its job. The camera is making adjustments to the shutter speed based on the amount of light that's entering the lens. That is aperture priority. It's a very powerful tool if you're shooting in changing lighting conditions. So, for example, as a wedding photographer, we'd be shooting the bride and the groom in the chapel, and now we're in the lobby, and now we're outside. And within 20 seconds, those are 3 different exposures or brightnesses I'm shooting in. The camera does all of the changing to the shutter speed for me, so I don't have to worry about changing it on the fly, right? So very, very powerful thing to keep in mind. We change the aperture, the camera changes the shutter speed. So the question then becomes, Michael, well, what if I want to change the brightness? It's a great question. That is where exposure compensation comes in. It's right here. The short answer is we're going to turn our exposure compensation dial to a plus number. And we'd be looking at the viewfinder, trying to figure out, how bright we want it. And we could take the picture. Oh, I'm still on electronic shutter. Let's get rid of that. Apologize. Right? So now it's brighter. And we can also go in the opposite direction. So it's a negative number. Now it's -2. Right? So I want to take a minute and explain how exposure compensation is working. In this shooting situation at 1/40th of a second with an even exposure, when I rotate the dial to say +1, what this is telling us, for every 1, it's twice the amount of light entering the camera. And we can prove this as I turn it down to 0 again, we're at 1/40th. So what we're basically saying is, camera, we want you to double the amount of light coming into the lens. And we know this is true because 1/40th of a second plus 1/40th of a second is 2/40ths of a second. If we simplify 2/40ths, that's 1/20th, right? Here it is. Now, if I was to say, let's say we wanted to add one more full stop, what do you think the shutter speed would be? If you said 1/10 of a second, you're absolutely correct. And we can even go up one more to 3 stops, 1/5 of a second. So every exposure value unit represents twice the amount of light, and that's reflected in the shutter speed. And that's what exposure compensation values mean, or stops. We're talking about stops of light. So when you hear that phrase, you might hear it with flash, you may hear it with shutter speed. One stop of light is twice the amount of another amount of light. That's what we're really getting to when we see exposure values. Now, there are some very important barriers to keep in mind when we're shooting an aperture priority. A shutter speed of 1/40th handheld, many of your pictures are going to be blurry because we are moving around, our subject is moving, and we want to use faster shutter speeds when we're hand holding the camera. We're even getting this warning here, right? So we want a faster shutter speed. And I'm looking at this, okay, we can Maybe we can turn our f-stops wider, but we've run into a limit of the lens. The lens, this particular kit lens at this focal length, can only open to f5. So the question you should be asking yourself was, wow, I want a faster shutter speed, but I'm only at f5. Man, what can I do? You know, you can add a light. Think about it for a minute. We haven't talked about ISO, but if you are familiar with ISO, we could come in and bump our ISO up. Now, an ISO is a boost of the sensor, and there are some drawbacks to using a very high ISO number. But when we added the ISO in here, you can see that the shutter speed changed. And this is something that some refer to as the exposure triangle. I don't like that term because it's really shutter speed and aperture that are controlling the amount of light. The ISO is an electronic gain. It's basically a way to cheat. In the time of film days, we would use more sensitive film, and it would be more grainy, right? In the age of digital cameras, we can just adjust this on the fly, and it's changing how much gain or how much boost we're adding to the sensor. Now, there's something I want to point out here, and just for the sake of the lesson, I'm going to turn this way up so you can see what a really grainy ISO looks like. We turned it way up. The camera shows a very fast shutter speed. We're going to zoom in and look at the edge of the blind here. You can see it's almost like salt and pepper. It's almost sort of like grainy. And that's what high ISOs do, is they add digital noise to the image. So as tempted as you may be to bump that ISO up whenever you need new light, you can't really do it limitlessly because it's going to introduce this grain. Now, if I pick an image, I'm playing back the images from earlier with an ISO of 400, and I zoom in, you can see that that graininess isn't there. And that's the trade-off with ISO. Very high ISOs are grainy. It's going to give you a boost. Very low ISOs are not so grainy, but you don't have that electronic boost when you need it. I was shooting in a gym last week for sports, and it was just dark, so I had no choice. I was shooting at 1200, 1600 because I needed that fast shutter speed. Most of the time, I like to stay at 400 or under for my ISO, but these cameras are quite capable of shooting 1600, 3200 without really getting a lot of grain. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. So my advice is that if you're shooting in aperture priority mode, is to always sneak a peek at your shutter speed. Keep an eye on this. We want to make sure that the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second or higher if we're hand holding it. If we're shooting sports, we want this number to be usually almost always 1/500th of a second or faster. Some slower, sports, certain types of like golf, for example, you could probably get away with 1/250th, maybe children. But once you get to an adult athlete that's running, you're going to need at least 1/500th of a second, maybe even faster. So always sneak a peek on your shutter speed when you are in aperture priority mode. Now, if we switch the mode dial to S, S stands for shutter priority. This is the opposite of aperture priority. In shutter priority, when we rotate with our primary numero uno finger, primary front wheel dial is your primary, it's going to change the shutter speed, not the aperture. And this is why users will get confused. They're like, oh my gosh, I thought this was the aperture. In manual mode, it's the aperture. But in aperture priority mode or shutter priority mode, it's going to change the primary setting. And in shutter priority, we dial in the shutter speed and the camera changes the aperture. Isn't that crazy? Watch this. Take your hand like we did earlier, cover the lens, the camera will start to change the aperture, not the shutter speed. So shutter priority is the exact opposite of aperture priority. We dial in the shutter speed, the camera handles the aperture. Sometimes beginners will use shutter priority for sports. They'll be out at the track and they'll say, well, Michael said to shoot at 1/500th of a second, and they'll dial it in and they're like, oh my gosh, it's dark. This is going to happen to you. If you're shooting on shutter priority, Camera's blinking. It is not happy. The exposure preview is telling us it's going to be too dark. What's happening here is the camera is protesting. It's saying, for the shutter speed that you have dialed in, I cannot open the aperture anymore. It's impossible, and this is the result that you're going to get if you take the picture. So when you see this, there is a way out of it, like we did with aperture priority, and that is to bump up our ISO. Again, we don't want to do it if we don't have to, but we will if it's the only way we can get the picture. Let's just turn it up to 6400. Now the blinking has stopped. So we've seen in both situations there are limits of physics in terms of the shutter speed and the aperture that may not give us the result that we want. And if we bump up our ISO, now we can use a faster shutter speed, and the camera is saying, this is the result that you'll get. So that is shutter priority. And the truth of the matter is I almost never use shutter priority. Even when I'm shooting sports, I prefer aperture priority, bump up my ISO, and I just sneak a peek at the shutter speed. I'm always looking here to make sure it's above 1/500th. And if not, I'll bump my ISO up. But that's just the way I shoot. I know some people that like shutter priority, they just want to dial it in. It's easier for them to keep track of. Do whatever works for you. I just really like aperture priority. So the third mode here is the program mode. And this one's a little wacky because when I rotate the front control wheel, you can see both the shutter speed and the aperture are changing. And what's happening is the camera is giving different combinations. So if you know you need, a fast shutter speed for sports, you may try to do something like this. Program mode is basically you're taking the training wheels off of the dummy mode, but I know professionals that actually use program mode and they use it all the time. Something you'll notice here is the exposure compensation stays respected when we jump between the P, S, or A mode. So if I bump this up or bump it down, the camera will remember it as I'm jumping through those three modes. So we can always just turn it back to 0. And if we're worried about bumping this, we could just lock it so now it doesn't change. So we've talked about the program mode, we've talked about the aperture priority, the shutter priority, and now we're going to talk about the manual mode. Manual mode is the mode that I personally use when I have enough time. So I'm not being rushed, I'm not at an event, I'm not dealing with changing lighting situations, or maybe I'm dealing with strobes. In the manual mode is exactly like it sounds. It means that we change the aperture, rotating the front control wheel. We can change the shutter speed by rotating the left rear control wheel, and the camera doesn't change anything. Even if we put our hand in front of the camera, there's no changes. It's telling us there's a problem, but the exposure compensation turns into a different indicator now. Watch. Here we have the exposure compensation indicator, and here we have the manual metering. The camera is telling us how over or underexposed it thinks it'll be. Oh, more than 2 exposure values. So that's what's going on, is there is no exposure compensation in the manual mode. We dial in the shutter speed, we dial in the aperture, we dial in the ISO, and we shoot. And it gives you the greatest amount of control. Something I need to point out here is there is also something referred to as auto ISO. Some people love it, some people hate it. I think it has a time and place. For example, if you were shooting indoor sports, MMA, for example, where you have changing lighting conditions, and athletes moving, where you need to dial in, let's say, a fast shutter speed, maybe 1/500th of a second, and you have a set aperture, and you have changing lighting conditions, well, now we can change that. We can give that control over to the camera, and the camera would change the ISO. I don't recommend really doing this unless you're dealing with these very wide lighting condition changes, because the camera is going to do what it thinks is best. Now we can set limits on this in the deep menu, but very rare situations I will use this. I know some people that love it because they don't have to change their ISO at all. They just put it on auto ISO and they shoot until their heart's content. But again, that problem is when the camera picks a very high ISO and introduces grain. So for that reason, I mostly like to dial in my ISO on my own. It's saying it's way too dark. So that is a quick overview of the mode dial, changing the exposure settings in each of the different modes, and explaining the philosophies of use and the ideas behind them. Again, just keep in mind 1/60th of a shutter speed if you're hand holding, say for a portrait, 1/500th of a second for adult athletes running. Those are the minimum shutter speeds that you want. If you're shooting very telephoto, you want to do the reciprocal rule at the minimum. That's, for example, if you have a 200 millimeter lens, you're going to want a 1/200th of a second. If you're 800 millimeter lens, 1/800th of a second, because movement is magnified over distance. So if you're trying to keep sharp images, those are definitely some good rules of thumb. For this lesson, I want to talk about the metering modes. And so I have set up a light. It's just the headlamp on a tripod to demonstrate how our metering modes work. Now, if you're unsure, just leave it on the evaluative metering mode. We can access our metering modes again by pushing our FN button and scrolling over here to our metering modes. Now, the easiest way for me to explain this is to talk about the spot metering mode first. Here it is. And you notice some weird things going on with the camera. I'm going to change this and I'm going to make sure we're on aperture priority. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little circle there. And as I move it away from the light, you can see that it's getting brighter, right? But when I move that little circle over the light, now everything's getting dark. And if I keep on turning it, now it gets bright again. What in the world is happening here? So what the metering modes are, essentially, they are patterns that we're telling the camera to look at and to measure the light in that pattern. So in the spot metering mode, we're telling the camera to look in this little spot and to make the exposure adjustment to the shutter speed, right? Aperture priority, based on the light entering that circle. So when I move that circle over a bright light, now the camera is recommending a much faster shutter speed. It's saying, hey, this is really, really bright in here. We might want to turn this down, right? That's what's going on with metering modes. It's very useful when you're using P, S, or A modes. Now, this isn't the only shape. Obviously, we have more shapes in here. The multi-metering mode is kind of like a general purpose one. There are different patterns, different sections. You can see for the most part, it doesn't change until I get to the very extreme edges. It prioritizes the center and in these quadrants here. I think it's a great general purpose metering mode. I think most of you probably be fine on it using that. And then there is a center weighted one. We don't see any lines here, but it gives more weight to the center area. Not quite as tight as the spot, but you can see it getting darker as we move that light towards the middle. Pretty good general purpose one if you like shooting into like heavy backlit situations, like a portrait photographer who likes to shoot the sun through vegetation. You know, I've seen those, a lot of them use the center weighted metering mode. Again, here's our spot. We can even go to a large spot versus a standard spot. We can do an entire screen where it's evaluating everything in the screen evenly. We could even go to a highlight, which means no matter where that highlight is, well, it looks like there's a little bit of weight in the center. It's going to go off. Let's talk about the deep menu system. There is a huge amount of information in here. I stopped counting a few cameras ago when it was like 70 or 80 items. And Sony has made huge strides in making this more easy to navigate. You'll notice that on the far left, we have different colored tabs to start. Gray is the My menu, which we will customize at the end. It's going to make sense if I show you this later. Red is for shooting. Pink is your exposure and color control. Focus is purple. Playback is blue. Using the Wi-Fi or network settings is green. And our camera settings are found in the yellow tab. And I'm navigating using this directional pad, up, down, left, right. So the way this works is that every tab has a different number of pages within them. You can see those pages as we scroll down. Some of them have more than one sheet of pages, so you can see this little arrow here on the bottom. I scroll down. And then to the right of those, we have different camera settings. So you're seeing this tree, this network of different menu options. The beautiful thing about this is now we can use our touchscreen to help navigate. That wasn't always there. Fairly recent update. Very nice. Thank you, Sony. Been asking for that for years. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the menu items that you're going to be accessing a lot. If something in here is a feature that requires a demonstration, we're going to set those aside for the crash course, and I will give you a full lesson on those. And you can also use your joystick to navigate. You can push into the camera body if you want to select something with the joystick. There's a number of different ways that we can select using the set button, whatever is easiest for you. For the sake of time, I'm going to give you the most important settings that I think you should set your camera to. If there's a feature in here that requires a demonstration, we'll do that on the crash course. There is a ton of information. So some of these things are not as important. You may find me skipping those. So number one, image quality. As I push to the right on the directional pad, we have the ability to change the file formats and the types of files that we're writing to our memory card, depending on whether we're shooting stills or video. JPEG is, just as you know, it's a simple JPEG image. It's not RAW. It's basically where the camera takes a RAW image, throws away a lot of data, and says, this is the most important. That's what we know as JPEG. Very small file sizes with, for the most part, lots of information that we can use, that you're used to, and you've been using this for years. So these new two file formats here, HEIF, high efficiency image format, the differences between JPEG, this JPEG, and these other two is the amount of color information that we're finding. And I would say in the beginning, just stick with JPEG. But if you wanted 10-bit color, 420, if you know what that is, there it is. And if you want 10-bit 422, there it is. I have a video on YouTube explaining what those terms mean, and this is where we select it. If you're a beginner, stick with JPEG. Image quality settings allows us to tell the camera where to write different file types depending on the type of shooting and preference we have. Think of it as if we have two cards in the camera, which one do we want to record, stills or video? That's probably the easiest example. But when we come into this menu, we have slot 1, and we have our RAW and JPEG, all this stuff, right, that we've talked about. Down here, we have the record media settings. The record media settings allow us to designate what is being written to which slot. So the way it's set up right now is I have stills, that's the camera icon, that means still images. It's recording to slot 1. And I have video images recorded to slot 2. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, some of you are wedding photographers and portrait photographers, or you're doing paid work and you don't really want video, but rather you want backups. You want them simultaneously written to both memory cards. So in that case, we can come in here and select simultaneous recording and also designate this for simultaneous recording. And then when we come into our image quality settings, you can see that we have RAW and JPEGs written to both memory cards. We have the RAW type here if we wanted to change that. We have the JPEG quality, maybe it's light, we'll change it to fine. And we have the image size, and we would hit OK and it would save those settings. There's some other ways we can do this. Let's say we wanted to sort our images between JPEGs and RAW. So now we have a way to come in here, and you can see that we have the two slots represented here. And because we only have JPEG selected, it's only giving us JPEG. But let's say we can designate this as RAW. So we could have one slot for our RAW files. We could have the other slot for our JPEG. We can change the file type as they're being written. File size, obviously RAW is the full resolution. And we can change these settings as I've already demonstrated. It's really pretty nice. Kind of confusing the first time you go through it, but let's just go to simultaneous recording for now. So this is because there's only one column now, it's basically saying that the same files, the same exact files are being written to both memory cards. So that's the important distinction between sort and simultaneous. I'm going to turn this back to 1. Now there is another option we see in here, which is auto switch media, which basically means is that if you are shooting stills, as we have this set up, to memory card 1, and it fills up, now the camera will switch it over to memory card 2 and just continue to record the images You don't have to worry about changing your memory cards or reading, hey, your memory cards are full. A lot of information in here, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward, and you will set this up according to your shooting style. Aspect ratio, I recommend keeping it at 3:2. That's the full sensor aspect ratio for the most part. If you have a reason to change it, this is where you would do it. I have friends that like shooting at 16:9, and I have another friend that likes shooting it in a square format, 1:1. Something you'll notice here is that we have a different icon. It's video camera. So this is saying the video camera file format. When we come in here, it gives us this warning, hey, you're in a still shooting mode. It's not the video settings. It's asking what video format do we want to record in? And there's lots of different kinds of information in here. Suffice to say that as we go higher up on this list, we have better data rates, faster data rates. And as we go lower, it's more compressed. So I'll demonstrate the data rates in just a second. But in the beginning, I like to shoot 4K. It's going to depend on your computer. If your computer can handle these faster data rates just because of the way the video files are created. But we can see the data rates when we come into movie settings. Hit OK. And now we have two settings in here. The first is the record frame rate. So if you're shooting for YouTube or you're shooting for video, you're almost always on 30p, which is 30 frames per second. You can also shoot at 60 frames per second if you want, or 24 frames per second, which is the standard for film. So if you were making a narrative film and you wanted to get that film-like look, you would choose 24. If you're shooting for YouTube, you'd go with 30 or 60. I almost always shoot on 30. This setting here is talking about this data rate that I was just mentioning earlier. So the M refers to megabits per second, and there's 8 megabits per megabyte. And the higher data rates mean in this case, there's even more color information, 422, 10-bit. If you're unfamiliar with those terms, again, I have a video on YouTube that will explain it. Or you can go with 100 megabits per second, 420, 8-bit. And this is typically what I'm recording at if I am doing a YouTube video. That's what I would recommend if you are shooting in 4K. But again, if you wanted to change, if you wanted to come in here and look at the HS 4K just to see what's different, we'd hit OK. And we get a couple more options in terms of the 100 megabit 10-bit 422, or if you wanted to go 50 10-bit. So really depends on what you're trying to do. We'll be spending a lot more time on the video settings and some of these descriptions in the crash course. APS-C S35 shooting. What this is doing is it's telling the camera to use a smaller part of the sensor. If you want to force this, you would come up to on. If you want the camera to decide to do it automatically, when it recognizes a crop sensor lens is connected to the camera, it will do it automatically. If you just wanted to shoot full frame all the time, you turn this off. So some people will ask, well, why would you want to crop the sensor? Well, because I have an amazing 10mm f4 lens that I use on the gimbal, basically Steadicam, but it is it was made for crop sensors. So it's not going to give full image projection onto the sensor, and we'd have this, a lot of black. It would just be black around the corners, but put it into crop mode, and now we have a great wide angle lens, light wide angle lens that we can use on a gimbal. I've been using it for 6 years. That's just one example. There are sports shooters who are willing to give up resolution to just shoot crop, and that's fine too. Smaller file sizes, things of that nature. But in the beginning, I would just say leave this to auto. Sometime we'll come to menu items that are grayed out, and if you try to select it, sometimes it'll tell you and it will be clear what you need to change, and sometimes it will not be as clear. But because I am on a multiple burst mode, it doesn't want me to do that. So I'm going to come up to single shot, come back down, and now we can talk about long exposure noise reduction. When we take images over a second long, they're considered long exposures. And sometimes we start to see noise artifacts and grain artifacts for very long exposures. So we can turn this on, and the JPEG compression will clean this up. I am pushing down on the directional pad to get to the next page. High ISO noise reduction is just like it sounds. If you are shooting very high ISOs, this would allow us to clean it up. I have it on normal most of the time for my JPEGs. HLG still image. If we don't have a high file selected, we're not going to see this. So we'd have to come back up, come into a high efficiency image format, turn that on, and then we can come back down in HLG still images on. And this essentially, think of it as a high dynamic range JPEG. There's more color information in there. My view on this is that if you're shooting for dynamic range and color information, just shoot in a raw format, you know. Sometimes high files are a little tricky to manage, but if you wanted to use it, this is what you would do. You turn it on and you would have this feature, basically higher dynamic range available in your high files. Again, we come down to color space, and now we can't select it because we have this turned on. And we need to come back up to go to JPEG only, come back down. And so now we've come back to the color space of sRGB. Color spaces essentially mean it's a range of colors the camera is using to produce, in this example, JPEGs. And in most cases, we're going to use sRGB. If you are shooting for a magazine and you're familiar with Adobe RGB, or you're doing a lot of print work, you're going to select Adobe RGB. The beginning and intermediate shooters out there, you're going to stick with sRGB. Lens compensation, very important to know about this. So what this is Sony makes software to help clean up a lot of this. For example, shading compensation is this darkening in the corners you'll see with wide-angle lenses. Chromatic aberration is a fringing that you will see as a blue or a purple or yellow, or in some cases magenta, green. And it's very annoying when you zoom in and see this in high contrast areas, and this will allow it to clean up. We also have this option here for distortion compensation. I'm not using a wide angle lens, but if I had a wide angle lens, it would also clean up. And for the most part, I would recommend leaving these on. Allow the software to clean it up a little bit. It's even more important when we're talking about video, because we're shooting 24 or 30 frames a second. That's a lot of defect that we're baking into the file that's not easy to clean up when we're done, especially when we're shooting with wide angle lenses. So for the most part, yeah, I just leave these on auto. So that was only the first tab. We have so much information. So when we come into the media, I like that they have the format memory card here. So if I wanted to clear off my memory cards, this is where I would do it. I'm not going to do it now because I've been taking some images on here, but it allows us to wipe the memory card clean. Everything will be erased and reset. This is how I redo my memory cards after everything's been backed up twice. Always have 2 copies of your images. Probably the best way to do it is one on the cloud, one on an external hard drive, or 2 external hard drives, maybe a Dropbox or something like that. You want to always keep one file somewhere else. And I've had a friend who lost all of her children images. She kept one hard drive, and the hard drive just eventually failed, and she's been trying to get it recovered, and it's been a nightmare. So you always want 2 copies before you back this up. What I'd recommend is get into a workflow where you are always recording the images to 2 places before you format your memory cards. Record media settings we've already seen, and this is a direct way to access this instead of going through all of the other ones up here as we did earlier. It's the same thing as this guy right here. So we've seen this. Recover image database refers to if you put your memory card into a computer and the database is corrupted by the computer and you put your memory card back into the camera, sometimes you'll have playback issues, and this feature will allow it to be rewritten or refixed so you can still access your images. Hasn't happened to me off the top of my memory, but Sony put it in here for a reason. So if you see that, this is how you fix it. And then finally, we have display media. If we just want to see the information that we have on our memory cards in terms of, what we're shooting on, the file size, the number of images remaining, and then the video settings. So that is tab 2. Tab 3, we're talking about how files are written to our memory card. The file settings allow us to designate whether this is a series, meaning it's continuously counting every time you switch the memory card, or do you want to reset it? I kind of like the series because it allows us to keep track of these different file numbers, right? Forced file number reset. So if you wanted to force a change, like if you were shooting 2 events in a day and you wanted to reset the memory cards, this is where you do it. You can change the folder name, or you can just cancel out. So we can also change the first 3 letters if we wanted to. If I wanted to delete these and write something else, I could. So I'm typing and I'm waiting. I'm going to cancel this. Also cancel this. Another thing we can do is that if we want to change the folder name where the images are held on our memory card, we could come in and select a date form. I just leave it on standard form. Something that we can do is have multiple folders on our memory card. If we wanted to create a new folder, we could. I'm just going to select that and hit OK. And then when I come into select record folder, now I have two different folders, the original one and the one I just created. I've done this a couple times when I'm shooting events where I have maybe two events in the same day and I just automatically want to keep them separate. It's just me, kind of an easy way to do it. So your IPTC information deals with you if you're working for the International Press Telecommunications Council. So if you don't know what this is, don't worry about it. It's essentially a way for reporters to embed their information into the EXIF data of the files. We can do the same with copyright information if you wanted to write your copyright or your name and embed that information into your memory cards. Also pretty cool idea. Just a way to help protect your images when you're giving them out to people. You want to help control that. And this is also writing the serial number of the camera onto the EXIF data because each camera has a specific serial number. So, if you're worried about your images, your original images getting ripped off and you have a way to prove it, hey, this is the serial number of the camera. This is my copyright information. This is where we would set this up. This next menu item, shooting mode, is very confusing because of how it's worded. Suffice it to say that on our mode dial on the top of the camera, we have three numbers up there. Those three numbers are presets where we can set the camera up exactly the way we like it, and we can save the presets to each of those numbers, and it'll be saved on the camera. So, there's different shooting style types. So if you're a sports shooter, you may prefer a certain shooting mode. You may like to shoot on aperture priority. But if you're shooting strobes, then you may want some different settings. And it's kind of a pain to have to set the camera up exactly the way you like it for each kind of shooting. So those three numbers on the top of the camera allow us to record our camera settings to each of those slots. That said, we can also save 4 additional slots onto the memory card where we can say, hey, we want to save these settings. It's on the memory card, which we should be able to transfer those settings from one camera to the other. Now, the way we go about this is a little bit different and it can be really confusing. So the idea is let's say I'm shooting, and just for the sake of this example, I'll go with shutter priority. You can see it here. And I like my drive mode a certain way. Just for the sake of this example, everything else is the way I like it, right? So then I would come into the menu and set up camera set memory. And you can see at the top, we have the three numbers. These correlate with the three numbers on our mode dial. And then we have M1, 2, 3, and 4. Those correlate with software memory settings that we'd put into a memory card. This is asking, where do you want me to save all of these settings that you have saved up? It's right. Well, I'm going to say, just for the sake of this example, let's save it to memory slot 3. Now it says it's registered, right? So you can't see this, but as I rotate the mode dial, I'm going to go through 1, 2, 3, and you can see the mode is reflected in what I just saved, and all of those camera settings are saved to that position. Most beginning and intermediate photographers, you're not going to need more than 3 of these things. And so you would just remember, hey, sports shooting is position 3, maybe portrait shooting is position 1, after you've saved them. This is where it gets a little confusing. Let's say that you wanted to save it to a memory card. Use one of these extra slots. So let's just save it right here, M1. Now it's registered. I'm going to turn this off of these numbers to show you a problem you're going to have. Come back in, and now the recall camera setting is grayed out. And when you come into it, it says, hey, this is disabled. All right, what Sony wants us to do is to turn the mode dial to one of the numbers. Once we do that, we can come back in. Now it's available, and we can choose any of them. Does that make sense? So I have empty slots. Here's the M1. So that is how it works. Think of the numbers only as saving to the camera, M1, 2, 3, and 4 to the memory card. We can even designate where that information is stored, whether slot 1 or slot 2. You should be able to take that memory card and transfer it to another camera and then recall media, right? This last item here is similar to what we just described, only we would save our camera settings to recall custom hold 1, 2, or 3. We can come in here and select from the menu specifically how we want to do it, or we can just import the current setting and then we would register it. So what this will allow us to do is in our button customizations, we could set up different buttons that if we were to push and hold that button, it would recall those settings as long as that button is held down. A little bit more complex, but some people like it. That's how you do it. USB streaming refers to using our cameras in a USB cable to stream video, for example, to the internet or a Zoom call. And you can come in here and choose the resolution and frame rate. In this case, I would just recommend sticking with HD 30 frames per second. It's a good resolution. When we go to 4K, we lose the number of frames per second. It's not going to look as good. And then we have a higher data rate if you want it to go at 60 frames per second. Beginners should start here. And we also have the ability to also record simultaneously to our memory cards. And if you wanted to do that, just keep in mind if you have dual recording, there is going to be a greater use of power. Drive mode here deals with what we've already discussed about the drive mode when we were demonstrating this. This is a menu way to access these settings. It's easier to access through the FN menu. We have our bracket settings, which is when we're telling the camera to take a series of different exposures that I've already demonstrated. We can use a self timer with a bracket, 2, 5, or 10 seconds. This would be used if you didn't want to shake the camera or have any vibrations. You would turn this on and there would be a 2-second timer. We can also change the order of the exposures from an even to an under to an overexposure. So underexposure is represented with a negative, overexposure is represented with a positive, and then even is 0. This just changes the order of how the images are recorded to the memory card. The intervalometer shooting is an excellent feature that I will demonstrate on the crash course. It's a little bit complex, but I'm going to take you down to the beach to show you how I would shoot a sunset using this feature. Suffice it to say, the interval shoot function allows us to program the camera to take images at different intervals. So I like to do it with sunsets, and we can see the progression of the clouds and how the sun moves over time. It's a pretty cool feature. So if we turn this on, now we have the ability to change different intervals, the number of shots, things of that nature. And again, I'll be demonstrating this on the crash course. Shutter and silent shooting features. If we are shooting, for example, on a movie set and we have to be perfectly quiet, we could come into this setting, go to silent mode, and turn it to on. And what this assumes is the camera is going to make all of the camera's features as silent as possible, including, how you're handling it, beep features, the sound the shutter makes when you close, turn it off. All of those things are automatically silent. If you do not want those features included in silent shooting, you could come in here and select which features to not target. For example, the aperture drive and autofocus. Or if we didn't want to hear the shutter close when we powered it off, we could select not target. That's just basically what it's allowing us to do, is to tweak how silent do you want your camera. Now there's this mention of auto pixel mapping. Pixel mapping is typically done automatically, but because it makes some noise, we can designate to turn it off. Dead pixels you'll see as red or white pixels on every image, and pixel mapping resets that problem and feature. So this is what this is referring to. Some other features we have in here is just selecting the shutter type. We can't do it because we're in the silent mode. So we could select mechanical or electronic shutter. By default, our camera is going to use an electronic first shutter curtain. Traditional film cameras used 2 mechanical shutters that would expose the media and then cover the media as you're shooting. In most cases, first shutter electronic curtain is fine. In very extreme types of shooting, very rapid sports, or in other situations, you may occasionally see something a little weird. And in those cases, you would want to come in and change this to off. That would make it a dual mechanical shutter. Release without lens simply means that we can take pictures without a lens being recognized. This is used when adapting non-Sony compatible lenses Let's say you have an adapter and you're putting like an old Zeiss lens or something from Russia on the front of it. Camera doesn't recognize it. This would allow us to still take pictures with it. Pinhole cameras, things of that nature. Release shutter without a card. This means we can release the shutter without having a memory card in it. I had a couple email me years ago saying, where are my images? We can't find them on the camera. They had this feature turned on. They went on a trip and they didn't have any images. Something to keep in mind. And the anti-flicker set allows us to access some tools to minimize flickering. I'm not going to go into this one, but this is how you access the settings. I think it's easier to adjust the shutter speed depending on the shooting environment we're in. You will also occasionally see flicker in certain types of sodium-based lamps, like street lights in, let's say, a race car, trackway kind of thing. And some of these tools can be very useful. So I'm going to turn this to off. Steady Shot deals with the image sensor stabilization. If you want to turn that off, you could do so here. Steady Shot, the auto setting recognizes Sony and Sony compatible lenses, where the camera would recognize the focal length. If, again, you're using a very old lens and you wanted to set the image stabilizer based on focal length, this is how you would do it. Come in here and set that. But in the meantime, I would recommend just leaving this on auto. This next feature, Zoom, deals with specific Sony lenses that have powered zoom motors. Essentially, it allows us to control how the zoom works, whether it's an optical zoom, a digital zoom, or a special feature referred to by Sony as clear image zoom, which the idea is you can zoom in without losing resolution. There are some really cool things you can do with lenses that are compatible, including adjust your zoom speeds on standby, whether you're recording. Shooting display deals with what we want to see on our viewfinder as we are shooting. For example, if we wanted to have a grid line display, there it is. We can change the type of grid. There's one with diagonals. So if somebody's doing a lot of architecture, maybe interior real estate, or you need specific alignment tools, this is where you would set that. Live view display set, we've talked about this already. Here we have the setting turned to on. This is going to give us an exposure preview. There are situations where you will want to turn this off. For example, if you're shooting with strobes in a studio setting, you would come in and turn it off. But for most of you, I would recommend leaving it on. We can even adjust whether this is working for natural lighting in flash or natural lighting only. In certain low light shooting situations, you may see this very low frame rate. What's happening is the camera is trying to allow us to see what's going on by using longer exposures. So this would allow us to turn that limit on to prevent that from happening. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just the red tab for stills, for shooting stills. Something I need to point out is that when we rotate the mode to a video icon and we come back into the menu, you're going to notice we have some items specific for video shooting, and I will cover these near the end of the menu section, the important ones, because I don't want to have confusion as I'm going through these. The pink tab are the formal exposure settings in the deep menu. There's not a lot of things in here I really access because you can get to them, through the shooting menu, through the function menu, but there are a couple important things I do want to point out. So in this first item, number 1, exposure control for ISO. Again, this is just a formal way to change it from the deep menu. It doesn't make sense to me because you can do this while you're shooting, pretty straightforward. But the ISO limit range does have an option in terms of setting your minimum and maximum. If you don't think you're ever going to use, for example, 200,000 ISO, we would set this lower. We also have the ability to set the auto ISO minimum shutter speed. And this is when we're shooting, for example, let's say on aperture priority and we have auto ISO, the camera has the ability to change that shutter speed. And if we want to set a hard limit on it, this is where we would do this. For example, if we're doing sports shooting and we don't want the camera to use a shutter speed slower than, let's say, 1/500th of a second, we could come in here and designate that We can say that the absolute minimum shutter speed would need to be 1/500th of a second. That's its purpose and use. Otherwise, just leave it on to this standard setting and the camera will make the decision. We have some flexibility when it says fast or slower, but until you get into the heavy sports shooting and know exactly the shutter speed that you want, this may not be necessary. So just leave it here for now. Exposure compensation, again, this is a formal place in the deep menu to set it. We've demonstrated this in the exposure lesson. We can change the increments of the exposure stops. So if we want to go by half stops, we could. I have it on third stops. This feature allows us to adjust the standard for each of the metering modes. I would say leave it here for now. Metering we talked about in demonstrating with the flashlight in terms of how they work. We can select those metering modes here. Face priority in multi-metering mode essentially gives the camera permission to value face patterns higher in its calculation of what the exposure setting should be. I think it's very useful, but if you like full control, for example, when you're using aperture priority over your exposure settings, you might want to turn this off. This is where you would do it. This is actually a really important setting. It's the spot metering point. What it means is that when we are using the spot metering mode, do you want it to be locked to the center point as I demonstrated, or would you prefer it to be associated with your focusing square? For example, a small, a medium, or a large focusing square. You would come in here in focus point link. That is going to tie your spot metering mode to your single focusing square. So when we're shooting with P, S, or A modes, sometimes you may want to lock your exposure. You can do it with the auto exposure lock feature on this button, or how most cameras work is when we push the shutter button halfway down or achieve focusing lock. And that is what we see in here. So when we get focusing lock, it's going to lock the exposure. If you want it to lock with a halfway shutter button depression, you can come here, select on, or you can turn it off completely and let the camera update the exposure, even pushing through the shutter button. So on the A74, there is no built-in flash. And so if we add an external flash, we would have the controls of the flash unit in most cases. Depends on the flash that you're using. Some flashes don't have those controls. But for all of the flashes that I teach, I recommend getting something significant and substantial, like minimum Godox TT685, made for Sony. It's about $120. Great way to introduce yourself to flash and learn those techniques. I talk about them on the crash course. But if you are using a flash that you don't have those controls over, you could come in here, for example, and choose regular flash, slow sync flash, where you might be firing flash with a very long shutter speed in aperture priority mode, or you might want to fire the flash at the end of the exposure, at the rear curtain, immediately before the rear curtain lifts. So that's what these settings mean. Again, I don't recommend doing a lot of this from the camera. We have flash exposure compensation. I'll demonstrate this on the crash course with the flash and show you how it works. We can control our exposure compensation for both ambient light and reflected light. Reflected light is the term I use for flash. There are some really great wireless flash settings. Anytime I do wireless flash, I'm typically putting on a commander unit. So something that can control the external speed lights. And Godox has one. I think it's like $60. Totally worth it. Very, very useful, powerful, reliable. And I also cover that on the crash course. Red eye reduction helps reduce, obviously, red eye when you're taking a picture. This feature by default is turned off. And this feature here deals with external speed lights not connected to the camera if you wanted to control some of that information, customization, firing. So this tab, white balance, this is the same options that we had in the other white balance lesson. This is just the formal deep menu way to access it. We have different priority sets when using auto white balance. There's a standard, and then we can also shift between ambient light and more, think of this towards a little bit more yellowish, and think of this as obviously more white. I leave it here for now. We also have the ability to lock our auto white balance with a halfway shutter button depression. I would leave this off for now. The color and tone features allow us to essentially change the ingredients of how JPEGs are baked. Obviously, we take a picture, it's raw data, the camera's processor converts it into a JPEG image. And if you compare a JPEG image to a raw image, they look very different. This is where some of these settings will start to happen. There's also some in the lens profile settings, but just going through each of these real quick. The dynamic range optimizer deals with slight differences in dynamic range in tones in terms of shades of bright and dark. The idea here is that maybe it'll make the darkers a little bit easier to see, adding some detail and maybe adjusting a little bit of the highlights, but in some cases you won't really notice it a whole lot. I leave it on, and I tell beginners to leave it on in the beginning, but if you want full control over the exposure and you don't want that extra help for JPEGs, you would turn it off. The creative looks deal with different sets of information that the camera is making for recommended shooting ingredients if you're baking JPEG, so to speak. When we come in here, we mostly see these letters. ST stands for standard, PT is portrait, NT is like a neutral tone, VV is vivid. For example, if we're shooting landscapes, we may get more vivid blues and greens. But these are just presets, but the idea on this is that you can push to the right and you can adjust things like your contrast, highlights, shadows, fade, saturation, sharpness range, and clarity. This is a little bit more important, I feel, when shooting video, because video, depending on what your format you're shooting in, the information is mostly cooked into a JPEG type of video format. With still images, we can import those and have greater control. But what I tell beginners is don't worry about this for now. It's just more complex than you need to worry about. Focus on your exposure settings and composition in focusing correctly. And then you can come in here and play in this if you become a heavy JPEG shooter and you want your JPEGs to be a little bit sharper, a little bit more saturated. And the idea on this is that if we continue to come down, you're going to notice that we'll get some numbers. And those number sets are basically presets where we can designate which creative type we want to start with by pushing up or down, as well as the individual settings. And then those would be saved and we could jump to them anytime in the future. But again, beginning and intermediate photographers, you don't need to worry about this right now. That's what it does. Picture profiles takes this to a completely different level. And again, we find that videographers use these settings more. Maybe they want to get a flat look with low contrast on their video because they want to add those into post. There's different color spaces, different gamuts, S-Log, for example. For beginning and intermediate photographers and videographers, I would say do not worry about this for now. There's tons of information out there. People have recipes that they like for their video shooting, but the idea is you'd come in here, you would start a picture profile that you want, for example, push to the right. We have different black levels and gammas, knees, saturations. It just takes it to a completely different level. Again, if you're just getting started, don't worry about this for now. Leave it on 0, which is basically off. A soft skin effect applies to humans if you want to soften the skin texture just a little bit. I personally prefer to do this in Photoshop if I'm doing any retouching, but some people like it. You can turn it on if you want to give it a try. That's how you do it. Zebra Display is a powerful exposure tool that will display diagonal lines or marching ants on edges that are overexposed. We turn it on by coming in and turning this on. And this is the key important thing is you can set your Zebra exposure level. It's asking, when do you want these marching ants to appear? I personally want to know when something is completely overexposed at 100% or greater. So I'll click that. I'm tapping my shutter button. And what I'm going to do is just start turning up my ISO. And when I get to the point that I'm overexposed, then we start to see the zebras. Anything that's overexposed or more, I can see it as this indicator. Pretty useful thing to know about. I'm going to come back in and turn it to off. The deep purple tab is for our focusing systems. On the top page, we have AFMF, The focusing modes allow us to determine in a formal location which focusing modes we're using. I prefer to do it with the C3 button. These next two, priority set in autofocus single, priority set in autofocus continuous, allow us to tell the camera which to prioritize, whether it's the autofocusing or if it's the release. In the beginning, you're going to find it on balanced emphasis. What these other settings mean, release means the camera may take the shot without it being completely in focus. When you have this setting AF, we're telling the camera to make sure it's a little bit more in focus before taking the shot. I don't recommend in autofocus continuous to focus on the autofocus because you're dealing with moving subjects, and what you'll notice is that it'll hesitate just a little bit, either release or balanced emphasis. This is going to be kind of dependent on the type of sport you're shooting, but it makes more sense for autofocus single because we're trying to get that single focusing lock. And so this does kind of make sense in this case. We can also change the tracking sensitivity, whether it's more responsive or more locked on. In the beginning, stick with 3. The autofocus illuminator is the little light in front of the camera that will kick on in dark situations. We only have 2 settings, auto or off. If you find it turning on and you don't want it on, you would come in here and select off. Aperture drive and autofocus, for now, leave it on to standard. I think that's fine. And then we also have the autofocus with shutter. In the event you want to customize your camera for back button focus, you would come in here and turn this to off. And what that does is it removes the focusing ability from the shutter button. So I'm pushing halfway down on the shutter button, nothing's happening. But when I push AF on, now I'm still getting my focus lock. That is how quick and easy back button focus setup is. If you forget that you've set this, if you've turned this off and go back to front shutter halfway depression focusing, you'll think your camera's broken. You're like, oh, my focusing isn't working. So just make sure that you check that before thinking something's wrong with your camera. And then we have the pre-autofocus, which I recommend leaving turned off. If you turn this on, what's going to happen is the camera will attempt to pre-focus wherever this focusing square is. And I have found that it kind of messes up what I want to do when I'm going for very specific focusing points. So I usually turn this one off. The focusing areas we talked about, this is just another formal location that we can navigate through them. The focus area limit, you'll notice we had tons of clusters to choose from. And if we don't want them appearing into our focus cluster menu, we can come in here and turn these off. Just gives us fewer options, simplifies it. You're probably going to want to do this once you become a niche shooter. Switch vertical to horizontal autofocus area. What this means is so what I'm demonstrating here is I'm holding the camera in the landscape orientation. If I was to take the camera and rotate it to the portrait orientation, that is what it's referring to as vertical. So what this is asking is, do you want to maintain the location of your autofocus point only, or do you want it to maintain the location of your autofocusing point and your autofocusing area? And if you select this, what this means is that when you bounce back and forth between vertical and horizontal, the camera will remember both the area and the specific location of the point the last time you used it. So for example, if you're shooting, let's say, some kind of a portrait shoot or a person or a family, and you're bouncing back and forth between landscape and portrait orientation, every time you moved back, the camera would remember the exact position of those focusing squares in the area that you were using. To me, it makes sense to put this on this middle selection, but if you don't want that, you can leave it to off. Focus area color. In the demonstration, the focusing box was white. You can change that to red if you want. Autofocus area registration, it's kind of an advanced tool, I would say. The idea is that you can save the exact position of where a focusing square is. So if I come in here and turn this on, it's basically saying we can register a focusing point by pressing and holding down the FN button. So if I come back out and let's say I put the focusing square right here, I'm going to push and hold the FN button down, and it tells us that it's registered the focusing area. And then when I want to have a custom quick recall for that, I would come into, when we talk about the customization, I would select which button I want to assign it to. In this case, it would be here. I'm going to select that. And then I'm going to jump back to the autofocus area. And it's basically saying, this is the registered autofocus area. If I hold this down, the focusing square will automatically jump to that position, or I could tap it and lift my fingers. So either one of those would assign that autofocus point to the button that you chose. I'm going to jump out. I'm going to turn this off. We could also delete that registration if we wanted to. I'll say sure. Autofocus area clear basically says, do you want your focusing cluster to disappear after a few moments? I don't recommend this, so I leave it to off. These next three can be pretty confusing. They're just subtle ways that we can see which focusing square we're using when we have our camera set up in certain ways. I kind of like leaving this one to on, and these first two to on. The area display for tracking, you have to be in a tracking focusing cluster to see it. So if I come down to tracking, also make sure that we're on autofocus continuous. Basically what this means is that when we're in a tracking mode, the focusing square stays on the screen. And for me, I think this makes sense because it allows you to reset. The camera is going to lock on. We don't have high contrast here, so what's happening is the tracking square is just going up. But the idea is that you would know where to re-begin your focusing as it's tracking the moving subject. So if you have lots of people running around, this tells you where to tell the camera to look first. In the second one, you're only going to see when you have like a wide or a zone square on. So if I come up to wide, if I focus, you can see these little green boxes. That's what this is referring to. If you don't want to see where it's exactly focusing, you would turn this off. Phase detection area will only work with certain compatible lenses, so I would say just don't worry about that for now. Circular point of focus, I would definitely recommend turning this one on to circulate. And what it means is that when we have a focusing square, especially something like a spot, it means that when we reach the limit of where we're focusing, the focusing cluster will jump to the other side, right? Or up and down, or left and right. It's very useful. And we can also change how fast that focusing square will move, whether it's by a standard amount or a large amount. I have it on standard for now. Page 3 of the focusing system deals with a lot of the customizations of face and eye detection. So we can prioritize eye detection, which we have turned on already. And we can also determine whether this is a human, animal, or a bird. Eye detection in animals is fairly new, and it's one of the most common comments I see in our Facebook groups. How come I'm not getting 100% keepers on animal or bird eye detection? And the truth of the matter is the algorithm can't always figure it out. And so if you're getting 70% keepers, you should be pretty happy with this eye detection. This allows us to prioritize whether we're looking for a human, some sort of creature, or a bird specifically. So there is a custom feature that will allow us to rapidly toggle between which subject we're shooting in. It's in the button customizations. I'm not going to show it to you on this video, but this would allow us to limit which of those three options we can toggle to if we have it set up to a custom button, for example, our AEL button. So if we turned off the bird, then we would only be able to toggle between humans and animals. Left or right eye selection. This allows us to tell the camera whether we want it to jump to the left eye or the right eye, or to automatically choose. I have it on auto. I like having the frame on to tell me when we are dealing with face detection. You can see it as this white frame, kind of hard to see. But if you didn't want to see that, you could turn this to off. Face memory means that we can tell the camera to remember specific face structures in humans. So if you have children and you're shooting them a lot and they have their friends and you just want to tell the camera to try to find your child's face, this is how you would do it. We'd say new registration. I have a model here, handsome guy. I'm going to shoot, putting his face in there. I'm going to register the face, and now the face is registered. Simple as that, right? Again, I wouldn't expect 100% keepers on this. We can even determine the order of multiple faces, like who do you want to show up more often? If you have a favorite child, maybe you would move them to the top. You can also delete the registered faces. Now, once that face is registered, we can also turn this on or off. You know, if you're shooting an event with lots of people and your child isn't there, maybe you want to turn it off so the camera won't be looking for your kid in the crowd of faces, right? So I'm going to turn this off for now. Autofocus magnifier in manual focus means is that when you are in manual focus and you rotate your focusing ring, it is going to jump in. So let's just do that real quick. Coming into MF, I am rotating my focusing ring and it's jumping in. I prefer that personally. If you don't, you would want to turn this off. The focus magnifier activates a magnifying feature that you can push into your set button and it will jump in. I believe we demonstrated this earlier. We can also determine the focusing time limit if you wanted it for just a few seconds or no limit. We can determine the initial magnification, again, of this focus magnifier, whether it's at normal view or 5 times zoom. And this last one's pretty cool. It's autofocus during focus magnifier. We're on manual focus right now. So if I come back in and turn this to, let's say, autofocus single, come back up, activate my focus magnifier. There it is. I'm going to press the set button to zoom in. And you'll notice we have these little crosshairs. If I push the shutter button halfway down, it's starting to engage focus. So this is a way, and it turns green once we achieve it. So you'll see this crosshair when this feature is turned on and you're zoomed in. Could be very useful for macro photographers or people who are trying to get very precise focusing position. It's really wonderful. But for the most part, I don't really use it. So I'm just going to turn it off for now. And then coming into this last page, this deals with the peaking focus that I demonstrated already in the focusing lessons. Peaking focus allows us to see areas of very sharp contrast to know exactly where the camera is focusing. Now, if you don't see it, as in this example, it's because my autofocus is on. I'm going to turn it to manual focus and you can see it now. We have it set to blue with a high level of intensity, but we have these other colors as well. And that is the deep purple tab, which deals with the focusing systems of our camera. Blue deals with the playback of images and some of the controls and settings when doing so. For example, on this first page, first item, we can select where we are playing back our images from, whether it's slot 1 or slot 2. We also have this view mode that we can come into, a date view, a folder view, or a movie view. I think date view is the one that I resonate with the most. Basically shows us when we were shooting and we can jump to that day and take a look at those images. On the far left over here, we can also jump between stills, videos. I actually have videos on another card, but that's going to allow us to navigate when we were shooting by different modes. Magnification means what it says. We can zoom in and enlarge an image if we want to. I just use the drag in and drag out. So if I'm playing an image, I can zoom in. I think it's just easier and more intuitive to do it that way. This gives us some other options if we want to control them from the menu. I never use them. We have the ability to protect our images by putting a key icon on it. This is something I almost never use. And for the most part, I just don't really delete a lot of images off the back of my camera. I typically delete them from my computer because sometimes I don't know how good an image is until I've imported it and touched it up a little bit. The idea on the protection is you put a key icon in it. It prevents you from accidentally deleting it. You can do it on multiple images, all with the same date, or cancel all of them with that date. The rating, very rarely use it, but the idea on this is that you can add a rating. Again, this is something that I do in Bridge. I don't really use Lightroom a lot. That surprises people, but typically I rate in Bridge, and then I decide which ones I'm going to process. This rating custom set tells us which rating options we want to have available. if we have it dedicated to a specific customizable button. Stars 1 through 5. Delete options. This top one is if we wanted to delete multiple images or all of them with a certain date. Sometimes you might be shooting and be running out of space and you have some images on there from last month and you don't really need them. You can come in here and do deletion of images without deleting everything on your card. This one's kind of cool. It allows us to delete the image by pressing the garbage icon button twice. The warning on this is be careful not to bump. Typically when we delete, we'll play an image, we hit the delete button, then we have to push up, select delete, and we delete an image that way. The double tap is faster, there's fewer steps, but there's a chance you might accidentally bump it twice and delete an image you don't want to. We can also have the delete confirmation default to be selected on delete first. So if I come in and press play, you can see that the delete's ready to go. And now we're only dealing with a few button presses. So it just gives you some options in how you're deleting images. The edit page gives us some options in terms of cropping an image. If we wanted to crop an image out, we could. Depending on the size of this, we can move it around with the joystick. We could change the aspect ratio by rotating the thumb button or the front. We can preview the crop, and then to crop it, we would hit enter. We can rotate a certain image depending on what we've shot. This is down at the beach the other night. I could rotate it if I wanted to. Pretty straightforward. Copying from one memory card to the other. So I'm shooting on memory card 1, coming into this copy feature, basically asking, do you want to copy all of the images on the date that you played to memory card 2? There are some cases I have used this. The photo capture feature allows us to export a still from a video. So we have a video file, we can export a single still. In this last one, the idea behind it is it allows us to use the camera as a HEIF player for HDMI. So typically you're going to have it on JPEG, but if you have HEIF files that you want to play out through your HDMI port, this is where you'd come and select that. Obviously, kind of an advanced feature. If you were to shoot using your intervalometer and you wanted to have a continuous play from that, I have some shots in here with the intervalometer that I'll save for the crash course, but you could play those images. We also have the play speed for the intervalometer, and we also have a slideshow. We used to do this with weddings where we would come in, we would shoot, let's say at a ceremony, and then we would come in and set up a TV at the reception, and we'd be playing back images that we just had taken, half an hour to an hour earlier, and the guests loved it. So we could have it loop. Obviously this was done on other cameras when I was shooting weddings still. Enter, and then the slideshow would begin, and every 5 seconds you would change the image. So I'm going to stop that. This final page in the blue tab deals with how we are playing back images. For example, when we're using the grid display, do we want 9 or 30 images? If you're wondering what the grid display is, I'm hitting play, press the grid display button, scroll down, and now I have 9. You can see them there. When we were doing a continuous burst in sports mode, for example, and you're taking 100 images, do you want them displayed as a group? You could do that. You would see them as a stack of images. Kind of saves when you're scrolling through multiple images to see the burst collection, so to speak, instead of all 150 images. Kind of a nice feature. You turn it on, and that is going to display those images as a stack of pictures. See if I can demonstrate it real quick. You can see that on the edge here we have the stack. Display rotation, I definitely recommend leaving it on auto. Basically is going to rotate these in playback for us automatically, even if you're rotating the camera into the portrait orientation. Focus display frame will tell us where the focus point was when we took the picture. It doesn't necessarily tell us where the camera was focusing, because you can obviously get a focus lock and recompose. It tells us which square was active when the picture was taken. Display specified time of image. It's not really intuitive. The idea is that you pick a date. If it's the exact date, the camera will then play the images from that date. Or if you didn't have any shoots on that day, it'll be the closest date to it. It's a way to navigate by time on playback. And then the jump image setting is that when you are in playback and you rotate the front or rear control wheels, it allows you to jump by different numbers. It's set on 1 in the beginning. So let's say we wanted to jump by more than 1. Say we could jump by 10 images using the front wheel, and that's what this setting will do. So we have customizable for the left, the right, and the front dial. That is the blue tab. The green tab deals with our smartphone connection, Wi-Fi connection, control of the camera through a remote app, things of that nature. And I'm going to cover this in a separate lesson because I believe it deserves its own setup. Let's talk about the yellow tab, which are the camera settings. There are some important and also some confusing things in here. A lot of this is very self-explanatory. For example, the languages you're using. If you use a different language on this list, obviously you'd want to change it. We have our date and time settings. The area setting, I live in the Honolulu time zone. We don't have daylight savings here. But this is where you would set your camera up if it was to change. Daylight savings, mine is turned to off. Also, Arizona doesn't have any daylight savings, believe it or not. Then we have our date and time, if you wanted to change it. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Just using the directional tab, and then when it's all set the way you like it, you would come in and hit OK. The date format, years, month, day, year. That's the one I have it set on. And then we just get the information about what time zone we're in, the date it is. If you live in the United States, you are going to want to set this to NTSC and leave it on NTSC. If you live in parts of Europe and you're familiar with PAL for the video system, you're going to want to change this. Obviously, there's tons of different settings that we can dial into our camera. And if we wanted to take those settings and put them into a different camera or maybe back them up, this is where we would do it. We could reset our camera setting by coming into this feature that would reset it to the factory defaults, or we could save the settings to a memory card. So if I was to save these settings here, save new, and then I was to take that memory card, put it into another camera, come into the same menu option and hit load, the camera settings would then update that camera to what it is now. You could also delete certain camera settings we have. This is very useful if you have more than one camera and you have it set up the way you like it and you don't want to fiddle with all these settings going through it in extra time, or multiple cameras, if it's a wedding photography team, for example. So now we get into the customization tabs. And the thing that I want to point out here is that when we bounce back and forth between 3 and 4, you'll notice the custom key and the dial set features. The first two on both of these are the same. And I know people are going to ask me, what is the difference between these two? The answer is there's no difference between those on the top. We're talking about these two right here. I think what happened was there were multiple sets of features to put in with the customizations, so Sony just included them in the top. But if you change an option here, it's going to change an option here. And the idea on this is that the icon determines what mode the customization applies to. And so in this case, it would be still photo. In this case, it would be video mode. And in this case, it would be playback. And the way it works is if we come all the way over and we get these pages of the camera, you're going to see little white numbers and little white outlines depending on what it is that we're about to change, what you want to be customized. I personally do really like the way the camera is set up. We set up the face detection. The button I would probably change is probably the auto exposure lock if I wanted something else here, maybe like, changing how face detection works. And we can do that real quick to demonstrate. So I'm going to come to the auto exposure lock hold button. You see the little white number 1. You see the 1 here. And let's change this to face detection type. So I'm going to choose face and eye subject select. This means that it's going to allow me to determine what type of animal I'm looking at, whether it's a person, an animal, or a bird. And so when I'm back out shooting, I can push this and you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner and on the bottom, I'm able to toggle between the types of eye detection that I'm using. So this is just an example, one example of how to customize a button in the case of the auto exposure lock button. And this would apply to all of them. I'd recommend that probably beginning and intermediate shooters should probably hold off on it until you're comfortable with your niche and you have a particular shooting style. Now, we could also do the same with video shooting. So when we flip it over to the video mode, we can customize those buttons the same, but for right now, most of the default options say follow the customization for still shooting. Then we have our playback customizations, and you'll notice the options in here are a little different. We don't have as many. Currently, it's also following. We also have the options to protect images or to send images by Wi-Fi. So when we press the FN button while we're shooting in stills or video, we get those 12 menu options, and you can determine which menu items will pop up. For example, if you didn't want your drive, if you wanted bracket or interval shooting, you would determine it here. Different set for stills or movie refers to whether you dial a setting in. Let's say you're in stills mode and you pick a certain aperture and then you flip the camera over to movie mode. Do you want the aperture to be remembered? If these are the same sets, the camera will respect your settings as you bounce back and forth between those. If you want them to be unique in their own, you would come in here and select which items you want to be different as you switch the camera back and forth between those two modes. Now your screen display set, so this deals with the type of information that we see in the viewfinder versus the back monitor. So if we come in here, you can see that we have different types of display information, our exposure, histogram levels, and we can determine which types of information are appearing in either of those two. Record with shutter button refers to if you're in the video mode, would you like to start and stop recording with your shutter button? I think it's pretty intuitive, so I'll just turn mine on. And then the zoom ring rotate, this applies to only certain lenses. The idea on this is that certain lenses are powered by servo motors, and you can determine how the lens is zooming in or out depending on the direction that you turn it. When we talk about our dial customizations, the first two here are the same that we just talked about. We also have a customization called My Dial Settings, which would allow us to customize how buttons and dials worked into these three different sets. The My Dial settings will then appear as a possible customization that you can have your camera jump to when you push down and to hold, for example, a customizable button like the AEL. It's kind of confusing. I don't think most beginning and even intermediate or advanced shooters would use it. This is for experts who have a very particular way of setting up their camera. We can also determine how the aperture priority and shutter priority, time value, how the dials rotate. In one direction, we would have it as normal. If you like it the opposite direction, you would come in and hit reverse. This usually deals with coming from different camera systems or having your camera set up a certain way that you're used to rotating your aperture in one way or your shutter speed in another direction. If you don't like it, you can come in here and choose reverse. This next one's grayed out function ring lens. This has to do with certain powered lenses where we can customize the ring to do different things like jumping to APS-C mode, for example. Lock operation parts. This allows us to lock certain wheels and features on our camera so that when we bump them, they do not change. We can lock the multi-selector wheel only. We can lock the multi-selector wheel in the dials, or we can lock everything. And if you have this on and you're not aware of it, you will think your camera is broken. It's one of the most common questions I get on a particular camera is when people bump a lock switch and they forget about it. But this allows us, if your camera is set up a very specific way and you know you're not going to change it, you may want to come in and lock it. Touch operation. This deals with the back monitor. You can obviously see that it's on. We can turn it on for playback only, or we can turn it off. Touch panel and touch pad. Those sound like two different things, but it's really talking about this guy here. When we are shooting using this back monitor, this is referred to as the touch panel. When we look through the viewfinder, we can still use this monitor, but it's referred to now as the touch pad. So panel, pad. And the idea is that as you're looking through the viewfinder, you could reach down with your thumb and change your focusing square, for example. So what this is asking is, what do you want to have active? Do you want both of them? Do you want just the panel as you're looking at the back monitor? Or do you only want the viewfinder? If you are unaware of both being on and you're shooting and you're touching the back monitor, the pad, the focusing square might jump around and you'll be like, holy cow, what's going on? I think that's why it usually comes default as this. But let's just have them both on for now. So we can come into the touch pad settings. Do you want this on in the vertical orientation? We'll leave that to on. And we're also asking, what part of the touchpad do you want active? So do you want the whole screen? Do you want the right half, the right quarter? And it's this gray part of the screen that's active. Now, another problem with this is going to depend if you're left-eyed or right-eyed dominant. I'm left-eyed dominant, which means my nose is going to be right here. So like I personally, if I was going to use this, I would be kind of stuck with using upper right, because as my nose is bumping the camera, I don't want the focus point to be changing. If you are right-eyed dominant and your nose is over here, then this side of the monitor is pretty much the one you're going to want to go with, like right half. If you don't have a big funky nose like me, then you might want to go with the full screen. So the idea on this is that as you look through the viewfinder, if you don't want to use the joystick, you can use the touchpad. And you can also change the position of it. So the touch position mode allows us to determine whether the area represents the entire viewfinder that we're looking in. So if you have a little square here and you're touching here, it would be the absolute position or the relative position. Play around with it. If you use it, you'll find out which one that you like and prefer more. This last setting here is the formal menu selection for the touch tracking feature that we've already demonstrated. If I come up and hit touch focus, I can move the focusing square around by touching on the screen, but you'll notice this little touch box up here. If I press that to a tracking mode, now I am having a tracking feature, and you'll notice that it's reflected the change in the deep menu. So it's just a formal way to change that setting. The next feature I have never seen on any other camera. It's the accessibility. Basically means that you're going to hear a voice. This has to be done in English, obviously. So if you turn your screen reader to on.
Set up tab, accessibility group, screen reader, on, button, delete button, display guide, menu button, back, speed, standard, button, delete button, display guide, menu button, back.
So you can see that what it's doing is it's reading everything on the screen. So I don't know how long a person could listen to that without going crazy, but it's a really nice feature for people that want some type of cue. Maybe you have bad vision and you can't really read the items. It's a great idea in terms of accessibility. It needs a little bit of work. Very cool. The Finder monitor settings deal with the difference between the Finder and the monitor. Now, in the beginning, we have it set up by default for this little infrared switch to change between the two. If you raise the camera up to your eye, it senses it. It's going to turn off the monitor. And then when we lower it, the monitor comes back on. This is a battery saving feature. There are times you are going to want to just leave one or the other on. For example, sport shooting. You may want to save the battery because you know you're going to be looking through the viewfinder every time you shoot. Or if, for example, I'm using a gimbal, and I'll demonstrate this on the crash course, sometimes the gimbal has some of the attachments close to the monitor and it'll turn it off. And so what I'll do is I'll come in and just leave it on manual for the monitor. And when that happens, you can see that it finally shuts off, and vice versa if I just wanted the viewfinder monitor to be on. But for now, I leave it on auto. We can adjust the monitor brightness. That's this back monitor, whether I wanted to make it brighter or darker. There's also a sunny setting. If it was sunny weather and we wanted it really bright, it's pretty much maximum brightness, right? Because it's hard to see sometimes in the sun. So we can do the same thing for the viewfinder. It's set to auto now. We can also change the color temperature of the viewfinder. Look at the viewfinder. You can come in there and change temperature if you want. Display quality, whether it's standard or high display. It's going to get your battery up a little bit quicker on high display. In the viewfinder, frame rate, same thing. We have a standard refreshment. If you put it on high, it's a higher quality. It's more rapid refreshment of the viewfinder at the cost of greater battery. These first three are pretty advanced. If you're a beginner, I wouldn't worry about them. This deals with the counter as we are recording video. The gamma display allows us to see how video is being recorded when we're using certain S-logs, for example, if we were to turn this on. We could also choose the type of display that we want to be reflected in the viewfinder. So probably far beyond the scope of a beginning or an intermediate videographer. Gamma logs are designed to capture wider dynamic ranges. Typically, it looks really flat when you're shooting it, and then when you import it, you can adjust the color and the contrast, and this allows us to see it as we're recording, depending on which of those flavors we're using. Remain shoot display is a buffer indicator bar. Let's see if we can pull it up real quick. That you'll see on the left-hand side when it's turned on. So there's not displayed. And this is what it looks like when it's on. You can see the buffer bar. There it is. And that as the buffer is filled, that bar will go lower and lower. It's a nice indicator that tells you when you're running out of space when you're doing high-speed bursts for sports, for example. This last one, still auto review, basically means when you take a picture, do you want the image to play back automatically? And we can choose the time it does so. So we have our power setting options, which is really battery saving, automatic camera shut off. Auto monitor off basically means is that when we are in a still shooting mode, do you want the monitor to turn off? If you don't want it to turn off, you leave it here, or the monitor could turn off after 2, 5, or 10 seconds. We also have a sleep mode for the camera. The camera will go into a sleep mode at these different intervals. I have it on 30 minutes because I'm teaching right now. In real world shooting, it's probably 1 or 2 minutes. Power saved by monitor essentially puts a power switch on our monitor as we open and close it. By default, mine was on to both linked. And let's say you have your monitor on and you flip it around and you turn it off. If you do this, you'll be able to hear the camera shutting down. Very faint noise. Looking through the viewfinder, you would also see that it's turned off. And then as you open it, the monitor is back on again. Kind of cool. And then we have our auto power off. Obviously, if Sony put this in there, they're aware that the A74 is overheating in certain video modes. There's a lot of information on YouTube about it. Sounds like when the monitor is closed, it will get warmer faster. If you're shooting at a higher frame rate, like 4K 60, it's going to overheat sooner. Sony batteries tend to extend the life a few minutes before it overheats, but the main thing is opening this up when you are shooting video and trying to use lower frame rates. You're going to get different mileage depending on your settings. Sound options, obviously, if we wanted to change the volume of the sound that we hear, the beeps. 4-channel monitoring basically allows us to send 2 more channels out, if my understanding, to the headphone jack if you wanted to record additional information in terms of sound. Usually sound in stereo has 2 channels, a left and a right channel. So when we record into the camera, we're only recording 2 channels. This option allows us to get to 4 channels. Pretty cool. And then we have our audio signals we can turn on or off. This USB setting allows us to determine how our USB terminal is being used. It's a compatibility feature that enhances what it can do. So this first item here, it makes sense to me. Just select it when you connect. If you're not getting the traction, if it's not working, USB streaming means that you're streaming video with your camera. So these next 2 are basically, we're turning the camera into removable media. We would plug the camera into a computer and then we could transfer files if we wanted to. Doesn't necessarily have to be computer. It could be another USB type of device. And then we have a PC terminal for a remote control. But again, if you leave it on here, you should be able to select when you connect it. The lens setting is basically, if you're having a hard time getting the connection you want, you would turn this to single, and then you would come up here and try to select which one you're using. This last one is the power supply, meaning that we can charge the battery in camera as it's plugged in. I like this feature. I like having it, even though I don't prefer using the camera to charge the battery. I have done it many times. I've been in a bind. It didn't have the charger. I had a cable, plugged the cable in, charged the battery, and I was good to go. We also have a very small HDMI terminal on the side of the camera. And this is going to allow us to control the resolution. For example, on the crash course, we talk about using an Atomos Ninja 5 as an external recorder. Why we would want to do that, the accessories we need to make it work. I shot a commercial with the Atomos Ninja 5. It was amazing footage. It was beautiful. We graded it. I was very happy with the result. We will show that video in some of the techniques involved. So typically, if we don't change it, it's going to do it automatically. If you know you're going to be recording in 4K, you would choose this resolution to output to that Atomos Ninja, for example. And we have these other two options, but if you can go 4K, go 4K. We have additional HDMI output control here, probably a little advanced for the pure beginning or intermediate videographer. But again, I'll be demonstrating HDMI output on the crash course. We can control whether or not we will get display settings. So if you're recording, typically you don't want to see things like the time code or aperture settings. And so we would turn this off to get a nice clean feed out of our HDMI. And then we also have the ability to control recording from the HDMI device, which is typically what I do is I start and stop recording from it. The video light mode deals with the control of a specific video light that you would obviously, if you're going to use it, you're going to purchase. It's going to come with instructions, but this has how that light works, some of the features in there. The anti-dust function, and I will demonstrate manual cleaning on the crash course. There's a couple tools that I use, but this feature is a built-in feature that vibrates essentially a cover over the sensor to kick off sensor dust. If you see these, they're like little specks you'll see at smaller apertures. And this is the auto cleaning. So when you turn the camera off, it'll happen automatically, or you could force it to happen immediately. If you wanted to force the camera to do that, you could. Auto pixel mapping is a feature to correct any dead pixels that you might see in your images. They're typically a white or a red pixel that's in every single image. And pixel mapping resets the sensor, so those are no longer there. I'll leave it to on. You can also force pixel mapping. Right now, if you wanted to, it would reset the pixels. It's worked. I have seen this work in the past. And then finally, we have the firmware version. So the software for the camera or the lens, you can see it here. And then if there's a new update for that firmware, then we could go in and update it. And that is the yellow tab. So let's talk about the My Menu tab. We have covered a huge number of menu items, and the reality is you're only going to use maybe a dozen of them tops. Some of the other ones, lesser known ones, you can dig through, but the ones that you use the most, we want to put them in a place where they're easy to locate. It doesn't take us, minutes of searching. And that's what this is all about. Think of it as a favorites tab. Now, the language that Sony uses is tabs on the far left, and the what I call sometimes subtabs or other tabs. These are really called pages by Sony. And then we have the items in here. And in this item, we're going to select add an item. It's going to show us a mirror of the menu, and it's basically asking, what do you want to add? So one item that I use frequently is the format memory card. I'm going to come over here, select format, I'm pressing the set button. It gives us the option to add it to up to 6 different custom pages. I'm going to add it to page 1, adds to this location. I'm pushing the set button. And now it's just asking me, what else do you want to add? I'm still in this mirror of the menu system. I'm going to come down to metering. For example, the spot metering mode tied to my focusing square. I think that's another good one for me personally. I'm going to add it to this first page right here. And it's added. Now I am still in this edition type of my menu. So I'm going to tap the shutter button to jump out of it, press the My Menu tab, and I can come up to this first page where I have my format and my spot metering point that have been added. If for whatever reason I want to sort them, I could come in here, select spot metering. I could still move it around to which location I want, move it up here, and we just flip them. I'm tapping the shutter button to jump out of that. I can also delete an item, delete a page, delete everything. And this last option, display from my menu, means is that when we go into our menu, so I'm going to tap that, I'm going to select a different tab here, tap the shutter button. So I was on purple, right? So when I press the menu button again, it jumps me right up to the My Menu tab instead of where I left off. So that is the My Menu tab. It's really great for customizing the items that you use the most and putting them into one location. Now I need to point out, even though we've gone through the menu system for the stills mode, there are a couple features that we need to be aware of when we flip over to video mode. You can see I'm in the video mode here, that when I press the menu button, some of these red options have changed. Now in the red tab, these pages are different. You'll see the video camera icon where we can choose the format, the file format for the video that we're recording in. We can also change our movie settings. So how many frames per second are we shooting? 60, 30, or 24? 30 is for video, 24 is typically for film or a film-like look, and then we have 60 frames per second. We also have the bit depth. The data rate is indicated on the far left, 140 megabits per second, and then we have the bit depth. If you're just getting started, I would recommend this first option, 100 megabits, 420. The slow and quick settings for shooting in slow motion. The idea on this is that we record at a faster frame rate and then we play it back at normal speed. It appears to be slow motion. I will be demonstrating this on the crash course. Proxy files are smaller video files that are easier to edit, and it's a second set of video files. So the idea on this is that you record proxy files small, and in the full resolution, you edit the proxy files, which will then give instructions to your computer on how to take the original footage and export it without overwhelming your computer. The formats that we use are very computer heavy in terms of processing. There's different formats. It's a lot to go into right now. Suffice it to say, it could be overwhelming for some computers, and in those cases, you would want to use the proxy files. Now, the second really important page I want to put out in here is on page 7 when we're talking about audio recording. You're going to want to keep an eye on your audio levels. We can control this by moving this guy to the left and right. And you'll notice that we have these channel monitors here, is that when you are recording video, you want to make sure that you are not clipping out. So if you see red, that's bad. I'm going to turn it up so you can see this. So you get that red mark, that's a bad thing. Keep an eye on your audio levels. And we also have some other audio level settings. So those are the important things that we need to keep aware of in the video record deep menu. So typically on these videos, I have a section where I'm talking about the Wi-Fi connection. And I've been having such a hard time connecting with it. I'm going to actually skip it and just say, keep an eye out for an upcoming video. I think there's some bugs with the app. It's just not working the way it's supposed to. I'm able to connect and then it kicks me out and there's no explanation for it. So if you're struggling getting your camera to connect, don't worry, I am too. And I have done probably 25 or 30 different videos connecting cameras to Wi-Fi. So something's going on here. There's some kind of incompatibility. So that's what's happening until there's an update. I'm not going to talk more about the Wi-Fi stuff, but hopefully it'll come soon and we can update you. When we're talking about accessories for our Sony A7 IV, especially if you're a new photographer, lenses are going to be one of your primary concerns. Every new photographer should have some type of general purpose lens. In the case of my Sonys, I use the 24-70 2.8 G Master. Now the G Masters are the cream of the crop. They're going to have this orange badge on them. This is the best you can buy. They're made by Sony for Sony cameras. They are super sharp, but they're also super expensive. Most of the good ones are over $2,000. If you're looking at a prime 1800s, they are expensive. And when you're just getting started, you may not even know the niche that you're shooting in. So you want to get a general purpose shooter in the focal range between 24-70 or 24-105. It's okay to invest a little bit of money, but the best you can get is the 24-70 2.8, I believe, G Master from Sony. Tamron makes a number of fantastic, high-performing, quality lenses. There's the 28-75, And then on the low end, Sony actually has a 28-70. It's not the sharpest. It's very affordable. Those are all some good options to start in the beginning. As you get further away from your subjects, you're going to want a zoom lens. I personally love the 70-200 2.8 G Master that's recently been updated. But again, Tamron has a bunch of really affordable alternatives, and there are even some low-end versions. So tons of information in regards to lenses. I will put a resource link in the description below where we're listing the Sony lenses, and I'll share some thoughts. I also have a gear bag that will take you to those lenses to purchase them for a small affiliate link. One of the most important accessories after the camera and the lenses are a tripod. And I tell all of my students, invest a little bit of extra money into your tripod. Don't buy one of these cheapy ones from Walmart that are gonna break in a few days that you can get for 40 or 50 bucks. They always break. Invest a little bit of money. I like the Bogen Manfrotto Be Free, the carbon fiber version. It's light, it's sturdy, it's going to last you for years. And there's also some higher end Bogen Manfrotto tripods. I'm shooting on one right now. Those are in the $400 to $500 range. There are some ball heads that I like. The 496 RC2, it's been updated, but that ball head will allow you to lock your camera in different positions if you're a photographer. If you're a videographer, you're looking more at something like a fluid head, and I'll cover that more on the crash course. If you do any kind of video work, you should invest into an external microphone. Now, in the beginning, many photographers will go out and spend hundreds of dollars on an external mic. Instead of doing that, I would recommend starting off with the Maven mic because it's 50 bucks. It's a great external microphone, and you'll save some money while you're still trying to figure out if you really want to get serious about video or not. If you know video's for you, take a look at the Rode Video Mic Pro. There's a couple different models. Those range anywhere from $200 to $300. And if you do any kind of video interviewing or talking head videos like I'm doing right now, you're looking at the Sennheiser E100. I've been using them for years. They're fantastic. Rode also makes the Wireless Go. I love these for their size, about $200 for a set. The quality is decent. It's not fantastic, but it will definitely work, and it will fit into a very tight space so it doesn't take up a lot of room in your camera bag. At some point in your career, you're going to want to invest into some lens filters. There is a Maven filter line coming out in 2022. I've been working on this for years, but the difference between my filters and other filters is that they're color coded, meaning that the color on the outside of the filter helps remind us what its function is used for, and it makes it a lot easier than fumbling through a bunch of black filters. I will post that link in the description as soon as it's ready. I get a lot of questions about sensor cleaning, and I will demonstrate this on the crash course using the tools that I prefer, and I'll also give you those links in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video and you like my teaching style, be sure to check out the Sony A74 crash course. I'll put that link in the description. Thank you for watching, and I am so looking forward to seeing your images, questions, and comments on our Facebook group. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.